This is Audible.
Harper Audio presents The Harlequin Tea Set and Other Stories by Agatha Christie, performed by Hugh Fraser, Isla Blair, and Simon Vance.
The Edge. Claire Halliwell walked down the short path that led from her cottage door to the gate. On her arm was a basket, and in the basket was a bottle of soup, some homemade jelly, and a few grapes. There were not many poor people in the small village of Damer's End, but such as there were assiduously looked after, and Claire was one of the most efficient of the parish workers. Claire Halliwell was 32. She had an upright carriage, a healthy colour, and nice brown eyes. She was not beautiful, but she looked fresh and pleasant, and very English. Everybody liked her, and said she was a good sort. Since her mother's death 2 years ago, she'd lived alone in the cottage with her dog, Rover. She kept poultry, and was fond of animals and of a healthy outdoor life. As she unlatched the gate, a 2-seater car swept past, and the driver, a girl in a red hat, waved a greeting. Claire responded, but for a moment her lips tightened. She felt that pang at her heart which always came when she saw Vivian Leigh, Gerald's wife. Meddenham Grange, which lay just a mile outside the village, had belonged to the Leighs for many generations. Sir Gerald Leigh, the present owner of the Grange, was a man old for his years and considered by many stiff in manner. His pomposity really covered a good deal of shyness. He and Claire had played together as children. Later, they'd been friends, and a closer and dearer tie had been confidently expected by many, including, it may be said, Claire herself. There was no hurry, of course, but some day. She left it so in her own mind. Some day. And then, just a year ago, the village had been startled by the news of Sir Gerald's marriage to a Miss Harper, a girl nobody had ever heard of. The new Lady Leigh had not been popular in the village. She took not the faintest interest in parochial matters, was bored by hunting, and loathed the country and outdoor sports. Many of the wiseacres shook their heads and wondered how it would end. It was easy to see where Sir Gerald's infatuation had come in. Vivian was a beauty. From head to foot she was a complete contrast to Claire Halliwell. Small, elfin, dainty, with golden red hair that curled enchantingly over her pretty ears, and big violet eyes that could shoot a sideways glance of provocation to the manner born. Gerald Leigh, in his simple man's way, had been anxious that his wife and Claire should be great friends. Claire was often asked to dine at the Grange, and Vivian made a pretty pretence of affectionate intimacy whenever they met. Hence that gay salutation of hers this morning. Claire walked on and did her errand. The vicar was also visiting the old woman in question, and he and Claire walked a few yards together afterwards, before their ways parted. They stood still for a minute, discussing parish affairs. "Jones has broken out again, I'm afraid," said the vicar, "and I had such hopes after he had volunteered of his own accord to take the pledge." "Disgusting," said Claire crisply. "It seems so to us," said Mr. Wilmot. "But we must remember that it is very hard to put ourselves in his place and realise his temptation. The desire for drink is unaccountable to us, but we all have our own temptations, and thus we can understand." "I suppose we have," said Claire uncertainly. The vicar glanced at her. "Some of us have the good fortune to be very little tempted," he said gently. "But even to those people their hour comes. Watch and pray, remember, that ye enter not into temptation." Then, bidding her good-bye, he walked briskly away. Claire went on thoughtfully, and presently she almost bumped into Sir Gerald Leigh. "Oh, hello, Claire. I was hoping to run across you. You look jolly fit. What a colour you've got." The colour had not been there a minute before. Leigh went on, "As I say, I was hoping to run across you. Vivian's got to go off to Bournemouth for the weekend. Her mother's not well. Can you dine with us Tuesday instead of tonight?" "Oh, yes. Tuesday will suit me just as well." "That's all right, then. Splendid. Must hurry along." Claire went home to find her one faithful domestic standing on the doorstep, looking out for her. "Oh, there you are, miss. Such a to-do. They've brought Rover home. He went off on his own this morning, and a car ran clean over him." Claire hurried to the dog's side. She adored animals, and Rover was her especial darling. She felt his legs one by one, and then ran her hands over his body. He groaned once or twice and licked her hand. "If there's any serious injury, it's internal," she said at last. "No bones seem to be broken." "Shall we get the vet to see him, miss?" Claire shook her head. She had little faith in the local vet. We'll wait until tomorrow. He doesn't seem to be in great pain, and his gums are a good colour, so there can't be much internal bleeding. Tomorrow, if I don't like the look of him, I'll take him over to Skippington in the car and let Reeves have a look at him. He's far and away the best man." On the following day, Rover seemed weaker. Claire duly carried out her project. The small town of Skippington was about 40 miles away, a long run, but Reeves, the vet there, was celebrated for many miles round. He diagnosed certain internal injuries, but held out good hopes of recovery, and Claire went away quite content to leave Rover in his charge. There was only one hotel of any pretensions in Skippington, the County Arms. It was mainly frequented by commercial travellers, for there was no good hunting country near Skippington, and it was off the track of the main roads for motorists. Lunch was not served till 1 o'clock, and as it wanted a few minutes to that hour, Claire amused herself by glancing over the entries in the open visitors' book. Suddenly, she gave a stifled exclamation. Surely she knew that handwriting, with its loops and whirls and flourishes. She had always considered it unmistakable. Even now she could have sworn... But of course it was clearly impossible. Vivian Lee was in Bournemouth. The entry itself showed it to be impossible. Mr. and Mrs. Cyril Brown, London. But in spite of herself, her eyes strayed back again and again to that curly writing, and on an impulse, she could not quite define, she asked abruptly of the woman in the office, "Mrs. Cyril Brown, I wonder if that is the same one I know." "A small lady, reddish hair, very pretty. She came in a red two-seater, madam, a Peugeot, I believe." Then it was. A coincidence would be too remarkable. As if in a dream, she heard the woman go on, "They were here just over a month ago for a weekend, and liked it so much they've come again. Newly married, I fancy." Claire heard herself saying, "Thank you. I don't think that could be my friend." Her voice sounded different, as though it belonged to someone else. Presently she was sitting in the dining room, quietly eating cold roast beef, her mind a maze of conflicting thoughts and emotions. She had no doubts whatever. She'd summed up Vivian pretty correctly on their first meeting. Vivian was that kind. She wondered vaguely who the man was. Someone Vivian had known before her marriage? Very likely. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. But Gerald. But what was she, Claire, to do about Gerald? He ought to know. Surely he ought to know. It was clearly her duty to tell him. She had discovered Vivian's secret by accident, but she must lose no time in acquainting Gerald with the facts. She was Gerald's friend, not Vivian's. But somehow or other she felt uncomfortable. Her conscience was not satisfied. On the face of it, her reasoning was good, but duty and inclination jumped suspiciously together. She admitted to herself that she disliked Vivian. Besides, if Gerald Lee were to divorce his wife, and Claire had no doubts at all that that was exactly what he would do, he was a man with an almost fanatical view of his own honour, then, well, the way would lie open for Gerald to come to her. Put like that, she shrank back fastidiously. Her own proposed action seemed naked and ugly. The personal element entered in too much. She could not be sure of her own motives. Claire was essentially a high-minded, conscientious woman. She strove now very earnestly to see where her duty lay. She wished, as she'd always wished, to do right. What was right in this case? What was wrong? By a pure accident, she'd come into possession of facts that affected vitally the man she loved, and the woman whom she disliked, and, yes, one might as well be frank, of whom she was bitterly jealous. She could ruin that woman. Was she justified in doing so? Claire had always held herself aloof from the backbiting and scandal, which is an inevitable part of village life. She hated to feel that she now resembled one of those human ghouls she'd always professed to despise. Suddenly, the vicar's words that morning flashed across her mind. Even to those people their hour comes. Was this her hour? Was this her temptation? Had it come insidiously, disguised as a duty? She was Claire Halliwell, a Christian, in love and charity with all men and women. If she were to tell Gerald, she must be quite sure that only impersonal motives guided her. For the present, she would say nothing. She paid her bill for luncheon and drove away, feeling an indescribable lightening of spirit. Indeed, she felt happier than she'd done for a long time. She felt glad that she'd had the strength to resist temptation, to do nothing mean or unworthy. Just for a second, it flashed across her mind that it might be a sense of power that had so lightened her spirits, but she dismissed the idea as fantastic. By Tuesday night, she was strengthened in her resolve. The revelation would not come through her. She must keep silence. Her own secret love for Gerald made speech impossible. Rather a high-minded view to take? Perhaps. But it was the only one possible for her. She arrived at the Grange in her own little car. Sir Gerald's chauffeur was at the front door to drive it round to the garage after she'd alighted, as the night was a wet one. He'd just driven off when Claire remembered some books which he'd borrowed and had brought with her to return. She called out, but the man did not hear her. The butler ran out after the car. So, for a minute or two, Claire was alone in the hall, close to the door of the drawing-room, which the butler had just unlatched prior to announcing her. Those inside the room, however, knew nothing of her arrival. And so it was that Vivian's voice, high-pitched, not quite the voice of a lady, rang out clearly and distinctly. "Oh, we're only waiting for Claire Halliwell. You must know her. Lives in the village. Supposed to be one of the local belles, but frightfully unattractive, really. She tried her best to catch Gerald, but he wasn't having any. Oh, yes, darling." This in answer to a muttered protest from her husband. "She did. You mayn't be aware of the fact, but she did her very utmost. Oh, poor old Claire. Good sort, but such a dump." Claire's face went dead white. Her hands, hanging against her sides, clenched themselves in anger such as she'd never known before. At that moment she could have murdered Vivian Leigh. It was only by a supreme physical effort that she regained control of herself. That, and the half-formed thought that she held it in her power to punish Vivian for those cruel words. The butler had returned with the books. He opened the door, announced her, and in another moment she was greeting a roomful of people in her usual pleasant manner. Vivian, exquisitely dressed in some dark wine colour that showed off her white fragility, was particularly affectionate and gushing. They didn't see half enough of Claire. She, Vivian, was going to learn golf, and Claire must come out with her on the links. Gerald was very attentive and kind. Though he had no suspicion that she'd overheard his wife's words, he had some vague idea of making up for them. He was very fond of Claire, and he wished Vivian wouldn't say the things she did. He and Claire had been friends, nothing more. And if there was any uneasy suspicion at the back of his mind that he was shirking the truth in that last statement, he put it away from him. After dinner, the talk fell on dogs, and Claire recounted Rover's accident. She purposely waited for a lull in the conversation to say, "So, on Saturday, I took him to Skippington." She heard the sudden rattle of Vivian Leigh's coffee cup on the saucer, but she did not look at her, yet. "See that man Reeves?" "Yes. He'll be all right, I think. I had lunch at the County Arms afterwards. Rather a decent little pub." She turned now to Vivian. "Have you ever stayed there?" If she'd had any doubts, they were swept aside. Vivian's answer came quick, in stammering haste. I? Oh, no, no, no. Fear was in her eyes. They were wide and dark with it, as they met Claire's. Claire's eyes told nothing. They were calm, scrutinizing. No one could have dreamt of the keen pleasure that they veiled. At that moment, Claire almost forgave Vivian for the words she'd overheard earlier that evening. She tasted in that moment a fullness of power that almost made her head reel. She held Vivian Lee in the hollow of her hand. The following day, she received a note from the other woman. Would Claire come up and have tea with her quietly that afternoon? Claire refused. Then Vivian called on her. Twice she came at hours when Claire was almost certain to be home. On the first occasion, Claire really was out. On the second, she slipped out by the back way when she saw Vivian coming up the path. She's not sure yet whether I know or not, she said to herself. She wants to find out without committing herself, but she shan't, not until I'm ready. Claire hardly knew herself what she was waiting for. She had decided to keep silence. That was the only straight and honourable course. She felt an additional glow of virtue when she remembered the extreme provocation she'd received. After overhearing the way Vivian talked of her behind her back, a weaker character, she felt, might have abandoned her good resolutions. She went twice to church on Sunday. First to early communion, from which she came out strengthened and uplifted. No personal feelings should weigh with her, nothing mean or petty. She went again to morning service. Mr. Wilmot preached on the famous prayer of the Pharisee. He sketched the life of that man, a good man, pillar of the church. And he pictured the slow, creeping blight of spiritual pride that distorted and soiled all that he was. Claire did not listen very attentively. Vivian was in the big square pew of the Lee family, and Claire knew by instinct that the other intended to get hold of her afterwards. So it fell out. Vivian attached herself to Claire, walked home with her, and asked if she might come in. Claire, of course, assented. They sat in Claire's little sitting room, bright with flowers and old-fashioned chintzes. Vivian's talk was desultory and jerky. I was in Bournemouth, you know, last weekend, she remarked presently. Gerald told me so, said Claire. They looked at each other. Vivian appeared almost plain today. Her face had a sharp, foxy look that robbed it of much of its charm. When you were at Skippington, began Vivian. When I was at Skippington, echoed Claire politely. You were speaking about some little hotel there. The County Arms, yes. You didn't know it, you said. I have been there once. Oh. She'd only to keep still and wait. Vivian was quite unfitted to bear a strain of any kind. Already she was breaking down under it. Suddenly she leant forward and spoke vehemently. You don't like me. You never have. You've always hated me. You're enjoying yourself now, playing with me like a cat with a mouse. You're cruel, cruel. That's why I'm afraid of you, because deep down you're cruel. Really, Vivian, said Claire sharply. You know, don't you? Yes, I can see that you know. You knew that night, when you spoke about Skippington. You found out somehow. Well, I want to know, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? Claire did not reply for a minute, and Vivian sprang to her feet. What are you going to do? I must know. You're not going to deny that you know all about it? I do not propose to deny anything, said Claire coldly. You saw me there that day? No. I saw your handwriting in the book. Mr. and Mrs. Cyril Brown. Vivian flushed darkly. Since then, continued Claire quietly, I have made inquiries. I find that you were not at Bournemouth that weekend. Your mother never sent for you. Exactly the same thing happened about 6 weeks previously. Vivian sank down again on the sofa. She burst into furious crying, the crying of a frightened child. What are you going to do? She gasped. Are you going to tell Gerald? "I don't know yet," said Claire. She felt calm, omnipotent. Vivian sat up, pushing the red curls back from her forehead. "Would you like to hear all about it?" "It would be as well, I think." Vivian poured out the whole story. There was no reticence in her. Cyril Brown was Cyril Haviland, a young engineer to whom she'd previously been engaged. His health failed, and he lost his job, whereupon he made no bones about jilting the penniless Vivian and marrying a rich widow many years older than himself. Soon afterwards, Vivian married Gerald Lee. She'd met Cyril again by chance. That was the first of many meetings. Cyril, backed by his wife's money, was prospering in his career and becoming a well-known figure. It was a sordid story, a story of backstairs meetings, of ceaseless lying and intrigue. "I love him so," Vivian repeated again and again, with a sudden moan, and each time the words made Claire feel physically sick. At last the stammering recital came to an end. Vivian muttered a shamefaced, "Well?" "What am I going to do?" asked Claire. "I can't tell you. I must have time to think." "You won't give me away to Gerald?" "It may be my duty to do so." "No, no." Vivian's voice rose to a hysterical shriek. "He'll divorce me. He won't listen to a word. He'll find out from that hotel and Cyril will be dragged into it, and then his wife will divorce him. Everything will go. His career, his health. He'll be penniless again, and he'd never forgive me. Never." "If you'll excuse me saying so," said Claire, "I don't think much of this Cyril of yours." Vivian paid no attention. "I tell you he'll hate me. Hate me. I can't bear it. Oh, don't tell Gerald. I'll do anything you like. But don't tell Gerald." "I must have time to decide," said Claire gravely. "I can't promise anything offhand. In the meantime, you and Cyril mustn't meet again." "No, no, we won't. I swear it." "When I know what's the right thing to do," said Claire, "I'll let you know." She got up. Vivian went out of the house in a furtive, slinking way, glancing back over her shoulder. Claire wrinkled her nose in disgust. A beastly affair. Would Vivian keep her promise not to see Cyril? Probably not. She was weak, rotten all through. That afternoon, Claire went for a long walk. There was a path which led along the downs. On the left, the green hills sloped gently down to the sea far below, while the path wound steadily upward. This walk was known locally as the Edge. Though safe enough if you kept to the path, it was dangerous to wander from it. Those insidious, gentle slopes were dangerous. Claire lost a dog there once. The animal had gone racing over the smooth grass, gaining momentum, had been unable to stop, and had gone over the edge of the cliff to be dashed to pieces on the sharp rocks below. The afternoon was clear and beautiful. From far below there came the ripple of the sea, a soothing murmur. Claire sat down on the short green turf and stared out over the blue water. She must face this thing clearly. What did she mean to do? She thought of Vivian with a kind of disgust. How the girl had crumpled up, how abjectly she had surrendered. Claire felt a rising contempt. She had no pluck, no grit. Nevertheless, much as she disliked Vivian, Claire decided that she would continue to spare her for the present. When she got home, she wrote a note to her, saying that although she could make no definite promise for the future, she had decided to keep silent for the present. Life went on much the same in Damer's End. It was noticed locally that Lady Lee was looking far from well. On the other hand, Claire Halliwell bloomed. Her eyes were brighter, she carried her head higher, and there was a new confidence and assurance in her manner. She and Lady Lee often met, and it was noticed on these occasions that the younger woman watched the older with a flattering attention to her slightest word. Sometimes Miss Halliwell would make remarks that seemed a little ambiguous, not entirely relevant to the matter in hand. She would suddenly say that she'd changed her mind about many things lately, that it was curious how a little thing might alter one's point of view entirely. One was apt to give way too much to pity, and that really was quite wrong. When she said things of that kind, she usually looked at Lady Lee in a peculiar way, and the latter would suddenly grow quite white and look almost terrified. But as the year drew on, these little subtleties became less apparent. Claire continued to make the same remarks, but Lady Lee seemed less affected by them. She began to recover her looks and spirits. Her old gay manner returned. One morning, when she was taking her dog for a walk, Claire met Gerald in a lane. The latter's spaniel fraternised with Rover, while his master talked to Claire. "Heard our news?" he said buoyantly. "I expect Vivian's told you." "What sort of news? Vivian hasn't mentioned anything in particular." "We're going abroad. For a year, but perhaps longer. Vivian's fed up with this place. She never has cared for it, you know." He sighed. For a moment or two he looked quite downcast. Gerald Lee was very proud of his home. "Anyway, I've promised her a change. I've taken a villa near Algiers. Wonderful place, by all accounts." He laughed a little self-consciously. "Quite a second honeymoon, eh?" For a minute or two, Claire could not speak. Something seemed to rise in her throat and suffocate her. She could see the white walls of the villa, the orange trees, smell the soft, perfumed breath of the south. A second honeymoon. They were going to escape. Vivian no longer believed in her threats. She was going away, carefree, gay, happy. Claire heard her own voice, a little hoarse in timbre, saying the appropriate things. "Oh, how lovely!" She envied them. Mercifully, at that moment, Rover and the spaniel decided to disagree. In the scuffle that ensued, further conversation was out of the question. That afternoon, Claire sat down and wrote a note to Vivian. She asked her to meet her on the Edge the following day, as she had something very important to say to her. The next morning dawned bright and cloudless. Claire walked up the steep path of the Edge with a lightened heart. What a perfect day! She was glad that she'd decided to say what had to be said out in the open, under the blue sky, instead of in her stuffy little sitting room. She was sorry for Vivian, very sorry indeed, but the thing had got to be done. She saw a yellow dot, like some yellow flower, higher up by the side of the path. As she came nearer, it resolved itself into the figure of Vivian, dressed in a yellow knitted frock, sitting in the short turf, her hands clasped round her knees. "Good morning," said Claire. "Isn't it a perfect morning?" "Is it?" said Vivian. "I haven't noticed. What is it you wanted to say to me?" Claire dropped down on the grass beside her. "Oh, I'm quite out of breath," she said apologetically. "It's a steep pull up here." "Damn you!" cried Vivian shrilly. "Why can't you say it, you smooth-faced devil, instead of torturing me?" Claire looked shocked, and Vivian hastily recanted. "Oh, I didn't mean that. I'm sorry, Claire. I am, indeed. Only, my nerves are all to pieces, and you're sitting here and talking about the weather. Well, it got me all rattled." "You'll have a nervous breakdown if you're not careful," said Claire coldly. Vivian gave a short laugh. "Go over the edge? No, I'm not that kind. I'll never be a loony. Now, tell me, what's all this about?" Claire was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, looking not at Vivian, but steadily out over the sea. "I thought it only fair to warn you that I can no longer keep silence about what happened last year." "You mean you'll go to Gerald with a whole story?" "Unless you tell him yourself. That would be infinitely the better way." Vivian laughed sharply. "You know well enough I haven't got the pluck to do that." Claire did not contradict the assertion. She'd had proof before of Vivian's utterly craven temper. It would be infinitely better, she repeated. Again Vivian gave that short, ugly laugh. It's your precious conscience, I suppose, that drives you to do this, she sneered. I dare say it seems very strange to you, said Claire quietly, but it honestly is that. Vivian's white, set face stared into hers. My God, she said, I really believe you mean it, too. You actually think that's the reason. It is the reason. No, it isn't. If so, you'd have done it before, long ago. Why didn't you? No, don't answer. I'll tell you. You got more pleasure out of holding it over me, that's why. You like to keep me on tenterhooks and make me wince and squirm. You'd say things, diabolical things, just to torment me and keep me perpetually on the jump. And so they did for a bit, till I got used to them. You got to feel secure, said Claire. You saw that, didn't you? But even then you held back, enjoying your sense of power. But now we're going away, escaping from you, perhaps even going to be happy. You couldn't stick that at any price, so your convenient conscience wakes up. She stopped, panting. Claire said, still very quietly, I can't prevent your saying all these fantastical things, but I can assure you they're not true. Vivian suddenly turned and caught her by the hand. Claire, for God's sake, I've been straight. I've done what you said. I've not seen Cyril again. I swear it. That's nothing to do with it. Claire, haven't you any pity? Any kindness? I'll go down on my knees to you. Tell Gerald yourself. If you tell him, he may forgive you. Vivian laughed scornfully. You know Gerald better than that. He'll be rabid, vindictive. He'll make me suffer. He'll make Cyril suffer. That's what I can't bear. Listen, Claire, he's doing so well. He's invented something, machinery. I don't understand about it, but it may be a wonderful success. He's working it out now. His wife supplies the money for it, of course, but she's suspicious, jealous. If she finds out, and she will find out if Gerald starts proceeding for divorce, she'll chuck Cyril. His work, everything. Cyril will be ruined. I'm not thinking of Cyril, said Claire. I'm thinking of Gerald. Why don't you think a little of him too? Gerald? I don't care that. She snapped her fingers for Gerald. I never have. We might as well have the truth now we're at it. But I do care for Cyril. I'm a rotter, through and through, I admit it. I dare say he's a rotter too, but my feeling for him, that isn't rotten. I'd die for him, do you hear? I'd die for him. That is easily said, said Claire derisively. You think I'm not in earnest? Listen, if you go on with this beastly business, I'll kill myself. Sooner than have Cyril brought into it and ruined, I'd do that. Claire remained unimpressed. You don't believe me? Said Vivian, panting. Suicide needs a lot of courage. Vivian flinched back as though she'd been struck. You got me there. Yes. I've no pluck. If there were an easy way... There's an easy way in front of you, said Claire. You've only got to run straight down that green slope. It would all be over in a couple of minutes. Remember that child last year? Yes, said Vivian thoughtfully. That would be easy. Quite easy, if one really wanted to. Claire laughed. Vivian turned to her. Let's have this out once more. Can't you see that by keeping silence as long as you have, you've no right to go back on it now? I'll not see Cyril again. I'll be a good wife to Gerald, I swear I will. Or I'll go away and never see him again. Whichever way you like. Claire. Claire got up. I advise you, she said, to tell your husband yourself. Otherwise, I shall. I see, said Vivian softly. Well, I can't let Cyril suffer. She got up, stood still as though considering for a minute or two, then ran lightly down the path, but instead of stopping, crossed it, and went down the slope. Once she turned her head and waved a hand gaily to Claire. Then she ran on gaily, lightly, as a child might run, out of sight. Claire stood petrified. Suddenly she heard cries, shouts, a clamour of voices, then silence. She picked her way stiffly down to the path. About 100 yards away, a party of people coming up had stopped. They were staring and pointing. Claire ran down and joined them. "Yes, miss, someone's fallen over the cliff. 2 men have gone down to see." She waited. Was it an hour? Or eternity? Or only a few minutes? A man came toiling up the ascent. It was the vicar in his shirt-sleeves. His coat had been taken off to cover what lay below. "Horrible," he said. His face was very white. Mercifully, death must have been instantaneous. He saw Claire and came over to her. "This must have been a terrible shock to you. You were taking a walk together, I understand." Claire heard herself answering mechanically. "Yes, they'd just parted. No, Lady Lee's manner had been quite normal. One of the group interposed the information that the lady was laughing and waving her hand. A terribly dangerous place. There ought to be a railing along the path." The vicar's voice rose again. "An accident. Yes, clearly an accident." And then suddenly Claire laughed. A hoarse, raucous laugh that echoed along the cliff. "That's a damned lie," she said. "I killed her." She felt someone patting her shoulder. A voice spoke soothingly. There. It's all right. You'll be all right presently." But Claire was not all right presently. She was never all right again. She persisted in the delusion, certainly a delusion, since at least 8 persons had witnessed the scene, that she had killed Vivian Leigh. She was very miserable till Nurse Lauriston came to take charge. Nurse Lauriston was very successful with mental cases. "Humour them, poor things," she would say comfortably. So she told Claire that she was a wardress from Pentonville Prison. Claire's sentence, she said, had been commuted to penal servitude for life. A room was fitted up as a cell. "And now, I think, we shall be quite happy and comfortable," said Nurse Lauriston to the doctor. "Round-bladed knives, if you like, doctor, but I don't think there's the least fear of suicide. She's not the type. Too self-centred. Funny how those are often the ones who go over the edge most easily." The Actress. The shabby man in the 4th row of the pit leant forward and stared incredulously at the stage. His shifty eyes narrowed furtively. "Nancy Taylor," he muttered. "By the Lord, little Nancy Taylor." His glance dropped to the programme in his hand. One name was printed slightly larger type than the rest. Olga Stormer. So that's what she calls herself. Fancy yourself a star, don't you, my lady? And you must be making a pretty little pot of money, too. Quite forgotten your name, ever was. Nancy Taylor, I dare say. I wonder now what you'd say if Jake Levitt should remind you of the fact." The curtain fell on the close of the first act. Hearty applause filled the auditorium. Olga Stormer, the great emotional actress whose name in a few short years had become a household word, was adding yet another triumph to her list of successes as Cora in The Avenging Angel. Jake Levitt did not join in the clapping, but a slow, appreciative grin gradually distended his mouth. God, what luck. Just when he was on his beam ends, too. She tried to bluff it out, he supposed, but she couldn't put it over on him. Properly worked, the thing was a gold mine. On the following morning, the first workings of Jake Levitt's gold mine became apparent. In her drawing-room, with its red lacquer and black hangings, Olga Stormer read and reread a letter thoughtfully. Her pale face, with with its exquisitely mobile features, was a little more set than usual, and every now and then the grey-green eyes under the level brows steadily envisaged the middle distance, as though she contemplated the threat behind rather than the actual words of the letter. In that wonderful voice of hers, which would throb with emotion or be as clear-cut as the click of a typewriter, Olga called, "Miss Jones!" A neat young woman with spectacles, a shorthand pad and pencil clasped in her hand, hastened from an adjoining room. "Ring up Mr. Danahan, please, and ask him to come round immediately." Sid Danahan, Olga Stormer's manager, entered the room with the usual apprehension of a man whose life it is to deal with and overcome the vagaries of the artistic female. To coax, to soothe, to bully, one at a time or all together, such was his daily routine. To his relief, Olga appeared calm and composed, and merely flicked a note across the table to him. "Read that." The letter was scrawled in an illiterate hand on cheap paper. "Dear Madam, I much appreciated your performance in The Avenging Angel last night. I fancy we have a mutual friend in Miss Nancy Taylor, late of Chicago. An article regarding her is to be published shortly. If you would care to discuss same, I could call upon you at any time convenient to yourself. Yours respectfully, Jake Levitt." Danahan looked slightly bewildered. "I don't quite get it. Who is this Nancy Taylor?" "A girl who would be better dead, Danny." There was a bitterness in her voice and a weariness that revealed her 34 years. A girl who was dead until this carrion crow brought her to life again. "Oh, then me, Danny. Just me." "This means blackmail, of course." She nodded. "Of course. And by a man who knows the art thoroughly." Danahan frowned, considering the matter. Olga, her cheek pillowed on a long, slender hand, watched him with unfathomable eyes. "What about bluff? Deny everything. He can't be sure that he hasn't been misled by a chance resemblance." Olga shook her head. "Levitt makes his living by blackmailing women. He's sure enough." "The police?" hinted Danahan doubtfully. Her faint, derisive smile was answer enough. Beneath her self-control, though he did not guess it, was the impatience of a keen brain watching a slower brain laboriously cover the ground it had already traversed in a flash. "You don't, think it might be wise for you to say something yourself to Sir Richard? That would partly spike his guns." The actress's engagement to Sir Richard Everard, MP, had been announced a few weeks previously. "I told Richard everything when he asked me to marry him." "My word, that was clever of you," said Danahan admiringly. Olga smiled a little. "It wasn't cleverness, Danny, dear. You wouldn't understand. All the same, if this man Levitt does what he threatens, my number is up. And incidentally, Richard's parliamentary career goes smash, too. No, as far as I can see, there are only two things to do." "Well?" "To pay, and that, of course, is endless, or to disappear, start again." The weariness again was very apparent in her voice. "It isn't even as though I've done anything I regretted. I was a half-starved little gutter waif, Danny, striving to keep straight. I shot a man, a beast of a man who deserved to be shot. The circumstances under which I killed him were such that no jury on earth would have convicted me. I know that now, but at the time I was only a frightened kid, and I ran." Danahan nodded. "I suppose," he said doubtfully, "there's nothing against this man Levitt we could get hold of." Olga shook her head. "Very unlikely. He's too much of a coward to go in for evil-doing." The sound of her own words seemed to strike her. A coward. I wonder if he couldn't work on that in some way. "If Sir Richard were to see him and frighten him," suggested Danahan. "Richard is too fine an instrument. You can't handle that sort of man with gloves on." "Well, let me see him. Forgive me, Danny, but I don't think you're subtle enough. Something between gloves and bare fists is needed. Let us say mittens. And that means a woman. Yes, I rather fancy a woman might do the trick. A woman with a certain amount of finesse, but who knows the baser side of life from bitter experience. Olga Stormer, for instance. Don't talk to me. I've got a plan coming. She leant forward, burying her face in her hands. She lifted it suddenly. What's the name of that girl who wants to understudy me? Margaret Ryan, isn't it? The girl with hair like mine. Her hair's all right, admitted Danahan grudgingly, his eyes resting on the bronze-gold coil surrounding Olga's head. It's just like yours, as you say, but she's no good any other way. I was going to sack her next week. If all goes well, you'll probably have to let her understudy Cora. She smothered his protests with a wave of her hand. Danny, answer me one question honestly. Do you think I can act? Really act, I mean. Or am I just an attractive woman who trails around in pretty dresses? Act? My God, Olga, there's been nobody like you since Doozer. Then if Levitt really is a coward, as I suspect, the thing will come off. No, I'm not going to tell you about it. I want you to get hold of the Ryan girl. Tell her I'm interested in her and want her to dine here tomorrow night. She'll come fast enough. I should say she would. The other thing I want is some good, strong knockout drops, something that will put anyone out of action for an hour or two, but leave them none the worse the next day. Danahan grinned. I can't guarantee our friend won't have a headache, but there will be no permanent damage done. Good. Run away now, Danny, and leave the rest to me. She raised her voice. Miss Jones! The spectacled young woman appeared with her usual alacrity. Take this down, please. Walking slowly up and down, Olga dictated the day's correspondence. But one answer she wrote with her own hand. Jake Levitt, in his dingy room, grinned as he tore open the expected envelope. Dear Sir, I cannot recall the lady of whom you speak, but I meet so many people that my memory is necessarily uncertain. I am always pleased to help any fellow actress, and shall be at home if you call this evening at 9 o'clock. Yours faithfully, Olga Stormer. Levitt nodded appreciatively. Clever note. She admitted nothing. Nevertheless, she was willing to treat. A gold mine was developing. At 9 o'clock precisely, Levitt stood outside the door of the actress's flat and pressed the bell. No one answered the summons, and he was about to press it again when he realized that the door was not latched. He pushed the door open and entered the hall. To his right was an open door leading into a brilliantly lighted room, a room decorated in scarlet and black. Levitt walked in. On the table under the lamp lay a sheet of paper on which were written the words, Please wait until I return. O. Stormer. Levitt sat down and waited. In spite of himself, a feeling of uneasiness was stealing over him. The flat was so very quiet. There was something eerie about the silence. Nothing wrong, of course. How could there be? But the room was so deadly quiet, and yet, quiet as it was, he had the preposterous, uncomfortable notion that he wasn't alone in it. Absurd. He wiped the perspiration from his brow, and still the impression grew stronger. He wasn't alone. With a muttered oath, he sprang up and began to pace up and down. In a minute the woman would return, and then... He stopped dead with a muffled cry. From beneath the black velvet hangings that draped the window, a hand protruded. He stooped and touched it. Cold. Horribly cold. A dead hand. With a cry, he flung back the curtains. A woman was lying there, one arm flung wide, the other doubled under her as she lay face downwards, her golden bronze hair lying in dishevelled masses on her neck. Olga Stormer! Tremblingly, his fingers sought the icy coldness of that wrist and felt for the pulse. As he thought, there was none. She was dead. She had escaped him, then, by taking the simplest way out. Suddenly his eyes were arrested by two ends of red cord finishing in fantastic tassels and half hidden by the masses of her hair. He touched them gingerly. The head sagged as he did so, and he caught a glimpse of a horrible purple face. He sprang back with a cry, his head whirling. There was something here he did not understand. His brief glimpse of her face, disfigured as it was, had shown him one thing. This was murder, not suicide. The woman had been strangled, and she was not Olga Stormer. What was that? A sound behind him. He wheeled round and looked straight into the terrified eyes of a maidservant crouching against the wall. Her face was as white as the cap and apron she wore, but he did not understand the fascinated horror in her eyes until her half-breathed words enlightened him to the peril in which he stood. "Oh, my God! You've killed her!" Even then, he did not quite realise. He replied, No, she was dead when I found her. I saw you do it. You pulled the cord and strangled her. I heard the gurgling cry she gave." The sweat broke out upon his brow in earnest. His mind went rapidly over his actions of the previous few minutes. She must have come in just as he had the two ends of cord in his hands. She had seen the sagging head and had taken his own cry as coming from the victim. He stared at her helplessly. There was no doubting what he saw in her face, terror and stupidity. She would tell the police she had seen the crime committed, and no cross-examination would shake her. He was sure of that. She would swear away his life with the unshakable conviction that she was speaking the truth. What a horrible, unforeseen chain of circumstances. Stop. Was it unforeseen? Was there some devilry here? On an impulse, he said, eyeing her narrowly, "That's not your mistress, you know." Her answer, given mechanically, threw a light upon the situation. "No, it's her actress friend, if you call 'em friends, seeing that they fought like cat and dog. They were at it tonight, hammer and tongs." A trap. He saw it now. "Where's your mistress?" "Went out 10 minutes ago." A trap. And he had walked into it like a lamb. A clever devil, this Olga Stormer. She had rid herself of a rival, and he was to suffer for the deed. Murder! My God! They hung a man for murder, and he was innocent, innocent. A stealthy rustle recalled him. The little maid was sidling towards the door. Her wits were beginning to work again. Her eyes wavered to the telephone, then back to the door. At all costs, he must silence her. It was the only way, as well as hang for a real crime as a fictitious one. She had no weapon, neither had he, but he had his hands. Then his heart gave a leap. On the table beside her, almost under her hand, lay a small, jewelled revolver. If he could reach it first... Instinct, or his eyes, warned her. She caught it up as he sprang and held it pointed at his breast. Awkwardly, as she held it, her finger was on the trigger, and she could hardly miss at that distance. He stopped dead. A revolver belonging to a woman like Olga Stormer would be pretty sure to be loaded. But there was one thing. She was no longer directly between him and the door. So long as he did not attack her, she might not have the nerve to shoot. Anyway, he must risk it. Zigzagging, he ran for the door, through the hall and out through the outer door, banging it behind him. He heard her voice, faint and shaky, calling, "Police! Murder!" She'd have to call louder than that before anyone was likely to hear her. He got a start anyway. Down the stairs he went, running down the open street, then slackening to a walk as a stray pedestrian turned the corner. He had his plan cut and dried. To Gravesend as quickly as possible. A boat was sailing from there that night for the remoter parts of the world. He knew the captain, a man who, for a consideration, would ask no questions. Once on board and out to sea, he would be safe. At 11 o'clock, Danahan's telephone rang. Olga's voice spoke. "Prepare a contract for Miss Ryan, will you? She's to understudy Cora. It's absolutely no use arguing. I owe her something after all the things I did to her tonight." "What?" "Yes, I think I'm out of my troubles. By the way, if she tells you tomorrow that I'm an ardent spiritualist and put her into a trance tonight, don't show open incredulity." "How?" "Knockout drops in the coffee, followed by scientific passes." After that, I painted her face with purple grease paint and put a tourniquet on her left arm. Mystified? Well, you must stay mystified until tomorrow. I haven't time to explain now. I must get out of the cap and apron before my faithful Maud returns from the pictures. There was a beautiful drama on tonight, she told me. But she missed the best drama of all. I played my best part tonight, Danny. The Mittens won. Jake Levitt is a coward, all right, and oh, Danny, I'm an actress. While the Light Lasts. The Ford car bumped from rut to rut, and the hot African sun poured down unmercifully. On either side of the so-called road stretched an unbroken line of trees and scrub, rising and falling in gently undulating lines as far as the eye could reach, the colouring a soft, deep yellow-green, the whole effect languorous and strangely quiet. Few birds stirred the slumbering silence. Once a snake wriggled across the road in front of the car, escaping the driver's efforts at destruction with sinuous ease. Once a native stepped out from the bush, dignified and upright. Behind him, a woman with an infant bound closely to her broad back, and complete household equipment, including a frying pan, balanced magnificently on her head. All these things George Crozier had not failed to point out to his wife, who had answered him with a monosyllabic lack of attention which irritated him. "Thinking of that fellow," he deduced wrathfully. It was thus that he was wont to allude in his mind to Deirdre Crozier's first husband, killed in the first year of the war. Killed, too, in the campaign against German West Africa. Natural she should, perhaps. He stole a glance at her. Her fairness, the pink and white smoothness of her cheek, the rounded lines of her figure, rather more rounded, perhaps, than they had been in those far-off days when she'd passively permitted him to become engaged to her, and then, in that first emotional scare of war, had abruptly cast him aside and made a war wedding of it with that lean, sunburnt boy-lover of hers, Tim Nugent. Well, well, the fellow was dead. Gallantly dead. And he, George Crozier, had married the girl he had always meant to marry. She was fond of him, too. How could she help it, when he was ready to gratify her every wish and had the money to do it, too? He reflected with some complacency on his last gift to her, at Kimberley, where, owing to his friendship with some of the directors of De Beers, he had been able to purchase a diamond which, in the ordinary way, would not have been in the market. A stone not remarkable as to size, but of a very exquisite and rare shade, a peculiar deep amber, almost old gold, a diamond such as you might not find in 100 years. And the look in her eyes when he gave it to her. Women were all the same about diamonds. The necessity of holding on with both hands to prevent himself being jerked out brought George Crozier back to the realities. He cried out, for perhaps the 14th time, with the pardonable irritation of a man who owns 2 Rolls-Royce cars and who's exercised his stud on the highways of civilization, "Good Lord, what a Ah, what a road! He went on angrily. Where the devil is this tobacco estate, anyway? It's over half an hour since we left Bulawayo. Lost in Rhodesia, said Deirdre lightly, between two involuntary leaps into the air. But the coffee-coloured driver responded with the cheering news that their destination was just round the next bend of the road. The manager of the estate, Mr. Walters, was waiting on the stoop to receive them with a touch of deference due to George Crozier's prominence in Union Tobacco. He introduced his daughter-in-law, who shepherded Deirdre through the cool, dark inner hall to a bedroom beyond, where she could remove the veil with which she was always careful to shield her complexion when motoring. As she unfastened the pins in her usual leisurely, graceful fashion, Deirdre's eyes swept round the whitewashed ugliness of the bare room. No luxuries here. And Deirdre, who loved comfort as a cat loves cream, shivered a little. On the wall, a text confronted her. What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? It demanded of all and sundry, and Deirdre, pleasantly conscious that the question had nothing to do with her, turned to accompany her shy and rather silent guide. She noted, but not in the least maliciously, the spreading hips and the unbecoming cheap cotton gown, and with a glow of quiet appreciation, her eyes dropped to the exquisite, costly simplicity of her own French white linen. Beautiful clothes, especially when worn by herself, roused in her the joy of the artist. The two men were waiting for her. It won't bore you to come round too, Mrs. Crozier. Not at all. I've never been over a tobacco factory. They stepped out into the still Rhodesian afternoon. These are seedlings here. We plant them out as required. You see, the manager's voice droned on, interpolated by her husband's sharp, staccato questions. Output, stamp duty, problems of coloured labour. She ceased to listen. This was Rhodesia. This was the land Tim had loved, where he and she were to have gone together after the war was over. If he'd not been killed. As always, the bitterness of revolt surged up in her at that thought. 2 short months. That was all they had. 2 months of happiness. If that, mingled rapture and pain, were happiness, was love ever happiness? Did not 1,000 tortures beset the lover's heart? She had lived intensely in that short space. But had she ever known the peace, the leisure, the quiet contentment of her present life? And for the first time she admitted, somewhat unwillingly, that perhaps all had been for the best. I wouldn't have liked living out here. I mightn't have been able to make Tim happy. I might have disappointed him. George loves me, and I'm very fond of him, and he's very, very good to me. Why, look at that diamond he bought me only the other day. And thinking of it, her eyelids drooped a little in pure pleasure. This is where we thread the leaves. Walters led the way into a long, low shed. On the floor were vast heaps of green leaves, and white-clad black boys squatted round them, picking and rejecting with deft fingers, sorting them into sizes, and stringing them by means of primitive needles on a long line of string. They worked with cheerful leisureliness, jesting amongst themselves, and showing their white teeth as they laughed. Now, out here... They passed through the shed into the daylight again, where the lines of leaves hung drying in the sun. Deirdre sniffed delicately at the faint, almost imperceptible fragrance that filled the air. Walters led the way into other sheds where the tobacco, kissed by the sun into faint yellow discoloration, underwent its further treatment. Dark here, with the browns swinging masses above, ready to fall to powder at a rough touch. The fragrance was stronger, almost overpowering, it seemed to Deirdre, and suddenly a sort of terror came upon her, a fear of she knew not what, that drove her from that menacing scented obscurity out into the sunlight. Crozier noted her pallor. "What's wrong, my dear? Don't you feel well? The sun, perhaps. Better not come round the plantations with us, Walters was solicitous. Mrs. Crozier had better go back to the house and rest. He called to a man a little distance away. "Mr. Arden, Mrs. Crozier's feeling a little done up with the heat. Just take her back to the house, will you?" The momentary feeling of dizziness was passing. Deirdre walked by Arden's side. She had yet hardly glanced at him. Deirdre. Her heart gave a leap, and then stood still. Only one person had ever spoken her name like that, with a faint stress on the first syllable that made of it a caress. She turned and stared at the man by her side. He was burnt, almost black by the sun. He walked with a limp, and on the cheek nearer hers was a long scar which altered his expression. But she knew him. Tim! For an eternity, it seemed to her, they gazed at each other, mute and trembling, and then, without knowing how or why, they were in each other's arms. Time rolled back for them. Then they drew apart again, and Deirdre, conscious, as she put it, of the idiocy of the question, said, "Then you're not dead?" No. They must have mistaken another chap for me. I was badly knocked on the head, but I came to and managed to crawl into the bush. After that, I don't know what happened for months and months, but a friendly tribe looked after me, and at last I got my proper wits again and managed to get back to civilization. He paused. I found you'd been married 6 months. Deirdre cried out, "Oh, Tim, understand, please, understand. It was so awful, the loneliness and the poverty. I didn't mind being poor with you, but when I was alone, I hadn't the nerve to stand up against the sordidness of it all." "It's all right, Deirdre. I did understand. I know you always have a hankering after the flesh pots. I took you from them once, but the second time, well, my nerve failed. I was pretty badly broken up, you see, and could hardly walk without a crutch, and then there was this scar." She interrupted him passionately. "Do you think I would have cared for that?" "No, I know you wouldn't. I was a fool. Some women did mind, you know. I made up my mind I'd manage to get a glimpse of you. If you looked happy, if I thought you were contented to be with Crozier, why then I'd remain dead. I did see you. You were just getting into a big car. You had on some lovely sable furs, things I'd never have been able to give you if I worked my fingers to the bone, and, well, you seemed happy enough. I hadn't the same strength and courage, the same belief in myself that I'd had before the war. All I could see was myself, broken and useless, barely able to earn enough money to keep you. And you looked so beautiful, Deirdre, such a queen amongst women, so worthy to have furs and jewels and lovely clothes and all the 101 luxuries Crozier could give you. That, and, well, the pain of seeing you together decided me. Everyone believed me dead. I would stay dead. The pain, repeated Deirdre in a low voice. Well, damn it all, Deirdre, it hurt. It isn't that I blame you, I don't, but it hurt. They were both silent. Then Tim raised her face to his and kissed it with a new tenderness. But that's all over now, sweetheart. The only thing to decide is how we're going to break it to Crozier. Oh! She drew herself away abruptly. I hadn't thought. She broke off as Crozier and the manager appeared round the angle of the path. With a swift turn of her head, she whispered, "Do nothing now. Leave it to me. I must prepare him. Where could I meet you tomorrow?" Nugent reflected. "I could come in to Bulawayo. How about the cafe near the Standard Bank? At 3 o'clock it would be pretty empty." Deirdre gave a brief nod of assent before turning her back on him and joining the other 2 men. Tim Nugent looked after her with a faint frown. Something in her manner puzzled him. Deirdre was very silent during the drive home. Sheltering behind the fiction of a touch of the sun, she deliberated on her course of action. How should she tell him? How would he take it? A strange lassitude seemed to possess her, and a growing desire to postpone the revelation as long as might be. Tomorrow would be soon enough. There would be plenty of time before 3 o'clock. The hotel was uncomfortable. Their room was on the ground floor, looking out onto an inner court. Deirdre stood that evening, sniffing the stale air and glancing distastefully at the tawdry furniture. Her mind flew to the easy luxury of Monkton Court amidst the Surrey pine woods. When her maid left her at last, she went slowly to her jewel case. In the palm of her hand, the golden diamond returned her stare. With an almost violent gesture, she returned it to the case and slammed down the lid. Tomorrow morning, she would tell George. She slept badly. It was stifling beneath the heavy folds of the mosquito netting. She awoke white and listless. Impossible to start a scene so early in the day. She lay in the small, close room all morning, resting. Lunchtime came upon her with a sense of shock. As they sat drinking coffee, George Crozier proposed a drive to the Matterpos. "Plenty of time if we start at once." Deirdre shook her head, pleading a headache, and she thought to herself, "That settles it. I can't rush the thing. After all, what does a day more or less matter? I'll explain to Tim." She waved goodbye to Crozier as he rattled off in the battered Ford. Then, glancing at her watch, she walked slowly to the meeting place. The cafe was deserted at this hour. They sat down at a little table and ordered the inevitable tea that South Africa drinks at all hours of the day and night. Neither of them said a word till the waitress brought it and withdrew to her fastness behind some pink curtains. Then Deirdre looked up and started as she met the intense watchfulness in his eyes. "Deirdre, have you told him?" She shook her head, moistening her lips, seeking for words that would not come. "Why not?" "I haven't had a chance. There hasn't been time." Even to herself, the words sounded halting and unconvincing. "It's not that. There's something else. I suspected it yesterday. I'm sure of it today. Deirdre, what is it?" She shook her head dumbly. "There's some reason why you don't want to leave George Crozier, why you don't want to come back to me. What is it?" It was true. As he said it, she knew it. Knew it with sudden, scorching shame, but knew it beyond any possibility of doubt. And still his eyes searched her. "It isn't that you love him, you don't. But there's something," she thought. "In another moment he'll see. Oh, God, don't let him." Suddenly his face whitened. "Deirdre, is it that there's going to be a child?" In a flash, she saw the chance he offered her. A wonderful way. Slowly, almost without her own volition, she bowed her head. She heard his quick breathing, then his voice, rather high and hard. "That alters things. I didn't know. We've got to find a different way out." He leant across the table and caught both her hands in his. "Deirdre, my darling, never think, never dream that you were in any way to blame. Whatever happens, remember that. I should have claimed you when I came back to England. I funked it, so it's up to me to do what I can to put things straight now. You see? Whatever happens, don't fret, darling. Nothing has been your fault." He lifted first one hand, then the other to his lips. Then she was alone, staring at the untasted tea. And strangely enough, it was only one thing that she saw. A gaudily illuminated text hanging on a whitewashed wall. The words seemed to spring out from it and hurl themselves at her. "What shall it profit a man?" She got up, paid for her tea, and went out. On his return, George Crozier was met by a request that his wife might not be disturbed. Her headache, the maid said, was very bad. It was 9 o'clock the next morning when he entered her bedroom, his face rather grave. Deirdre was sitting up in bed. She looked white and haggard, but her eyes shone. "George, I've got something to tell you, something rather terrible." He interrupted her brusquely. "So you've heard. I was afraid it might upset you." "Upset me?" "Yes. You talked to the poor young fellow that day." He saw her hand steal to her heart, her eyelids flicker. Then she said in a low, quick voice that somehow frightened him, "I've heard nothing. Tell me quickly. I thought... Tell me." "Out at that tobacco estate. Chap shot himself. Badly broken up in the war, nerves all to pieces, I suppose. There's no other reason to account for it." "He shot himself in that dark shed where the tobacco was hanging." She spoke with certainty, her eyes like a sleepwalker's, as she saw before her in the odorous darkness a figure lying there, revolver in hand. "Why, to be sure. That's where you were taken queer yesterday. Odd thing, that." Deirdre did not answer. She saw another picture, a table with tea things on it, and a woman bowing her head in acceptance of a lie. "Well, well, the war has a lot to answer for," said Crozier, and stretched out his hand for a match, lighting his pipe with careful puffs. His wife's cry startled him. "Oh, don't! Don't! I can't bear the smell!" He stared at her in kindly astonishment. "My dear girl, you mustn't be nervy. After all, you can't escape from the smell of tobacco. You'll meet it everywhere." "Yes, everywhere." She smiled a slow, twisted smile, and murmured some words that he did not catch, words that she had chosen for the original obituary notice of Tim Nugent's death. "While the light lasts, I shall remember, and in the darkness I shall not forget." Her eyes widened as they followed the ascending spiral of smoke, and she repeated in a low, monotonous voice, "Everywhere, everywhere." The House of Dreams. This is the story of John Seagrave, of his life, which was unsatisfactory, of his love, which was unsatisfied, of his dreams, and of his death. And if in the two latter he found what was denied in the two former, then his life may, after all, be taken as a success. Who knows? John Seagrave came of a family which had been slowly going downhill for the last century. They'd been landowners since the days of Elizabeth, but their last piece of property was sold. It was thought well that one of the sons at least should acquire the useful art of money-making. It was an unconscious irony of fate that John should be the chosen one. With his strangely sensitive mouth, and the long, dark blue slits of eyes that suggested an elf or a faun, something wild and of the woods, it was incongruous that he should be offered up, a sacrifice on the altar of finance. The smell of the earth, the taste of the sea salt on one's lips, and the free sky above one's head, these were the things beloved by John Seagrave, to which he was to bid farewell. At the age of 18, he became a junior clerk in a big business house. 7 years later, he was still a clerk, not quite so junior, but with status otherwise unchanged. The faculty for getting on in the world had been omitted from his makeup. He was punctual, industrious, plodding, a clerk, and nothing but a clerk. And yet he might have been what? He could hardly answer that question himself, but he could not rid himself of the conviction that somewhere there was a life in which he could have counted. There was power in him, swiftness of vision, something of which his fellow toilers had never had a glimpse. They liked him. He was popular because of his air of careless friendship, but they never appreciated the fact that he barred them by that same manner from any real intimacy. The dream came to him suddenly. It was no childish fantasy growing and developing through the years. It came on a midsummer night, or rather early morning, and he woke from it tingling all over, striving to hold it to him as it fled, slipping from his clutch in the elusive way dreams have. Desperately, he clung to it. It must not go, it must not. He must remember the house. It was the house, of course. The house he knew so well. Was it a real house, or did he merely know it in dreams? He didn't remember, but he certainly knew it very well. The faint grey light of the early morning was stealing into the room. The stillness was extraordinary. At 4:30 a.m., London, weary London, found her brief instant of peace. John Seagrave lay quiet, wrapped in the joy, the exquisite wonder and beauty of his dream. How clever it had been of him to remember it. A dream flitted so quickly as a rule, ran past you just as with waking consciousness your clumsy fingers sought to stop and hold it. But he'd been too quick for this dream. He had seized it as it was slipping swiftly by him. It really was a most remarkable dream. There was the house, and his thoughts were brought up with a jerk, for when he came to think of it, he couldn't remember anything but the house. And suddenly, with a tinge of disappointment, he recognized that, after all, the house was quite strange to him. He hadn't even dreamed of it before. It was a white house, standing on high ground. There were trees near it, blue hills in the distance, but its peculiar charm was independent of surroundings, for, and this was the point, the climax of the dream, it was a beautiful, a strangely beautiful house. His pulse quickened as he remembered anew the strange beauty of the house. The outside of it, of course, for he hadn't been inside. There'd been no question of that, no question of it whatsoever. Then, as the dingy outlines of his bed-sitting room began to take shape in the growing light, he experienced the disillusion of the dreamer. Perhaps, after all, his dream hadn't been so very wonderful, or had the wonderful, the explanatory part, slipped past him, and laughed at his ineffectual clutching hands. A white house, standing on high ground. There wasn't much to get excited about, surely. It was rather a big house, he remembered, with a lot of windows in it, and the blinds were all down. Not because the people were away, he was sure of that, but because it was so early that no one was up yet. Then he laughed at the absurdity of his imaginings, and remembered that he was to dine with Mr. Wetterman that night. Maisie Wetterman was Rudolph Wetterman's only daughter, and she'd been accustomed all her life to having exactly what she wanted. Paying a visit to her father's office one day, she'd noticed John Seagrave. He had brought in some letters that her father had asked for. When he'd departed again, she asked her father about him. Wetterman was communicative. "One of Sir Edward Seagrave's sons. Fine old family, but on its last legs. This boy will never set the Thames on fire. Oh, I like him all right, but there's nothing to him. No punch of any kind." Maisie was perhaps indifferent to punch. It was a quality valued more by her parent than herself. Anyway, a fortnight later, she persuaded her father to ask John Seagrave to dinner. It was an intimate dinner, herself and her father, John Seagrave, and a girlfriend who was staying with her. The girlfriend was moved to make a few remarks. "On approval, I suppose, Maisie. Later, father will do it up in a nice little parcel and bring it home from the city as a present to his dear little daughter, duly bought and paid for." "Oh, Allegra, you are the limit." Allegra Kerr laughed. "You do take fancies, you know, Maisie. I like that hat. I must have it. If hats, why not husbands?" "Don't be absurd. I've hardly spoken to him yet." "No, but you've made up your mind," said the other girl. "What's the attraction, Maisie?" "I don't know," said Maisie Wetterman slowly. "He's different." "Different?" "Yes, I can't explain. He's good-looking, you know, in a queer sort of way, but it's not that. He's a way of not seeing you're there. Really, I don't believe he as much as glanced at me that day in Father's office." Allegra laughed. "That's an old trick. Rather an astute young man, I should say." "Oh, Allegra, you're hateful." "Cheer up, darling. Father will buy a woolly lamb for his little Maisie-kins." "I don't want it to be like that." "Love with a capital L, is that it?" "Why shouldn't he fall in love with me?" "No reason at all. I expect he will." Allegra smiled as she spoke, and let her glance sweep over the other. Maisie Wetterman was short, inclined to be plump. She had dark hair, well shingled and artistically waved. Her naturally good complexion was enhanced by the latest colours in powder and lipstick. She had a good mouth and teeth, dark eyes, rather small and twinkly, and a jaw and chin slightly on the heavy side. She was beautifully dressed. "Yes," said Allegra, finishing her scrutiny. "I've no doubt he will. The whole effect is really very good, Maisie." Her friend looked at her doubtfully. "I mean it," said Allegra. "I mean it, honour bright. But just supposing, for the sake of argument, that he shouldn't. Fall in love, I mean. Suppose his affection to become sincere but platonic. What then? I may not like him at all when I know him better." "Quite so. On the other hand, you may like him very much indeed. And in the latter case—" Maisie shrugged her shoulders. "I should hope I've too much pride." Allegra interrupted. "Pride comes in handy for masking one's feelings. It doesn't stop you from feeling them." "Well," said Maisie, flushed, "I don't see why I shouldn't say it. I am a very good match. I mean, from his point of view. Father's daughter and everything." "Partnership in the offing, etc.," said Allegra. "Yes, Maisie. You're your father's daughter, all right. I'm awfully pleased. I do like my friends to run true to type." The faint mockery of her tone made the other uneasy. "You are hateful, Allegra, but stimulating, darling. That's why you have me here. I'm a student of history, you know, and it always intrigued me why the court jester was permitted and encouraged. Now that I'm one myself, I see the point. It's rather a good role, you see. I had to do something. There was I, proud and penniless like the heroine of a novelette, well-born and badly educated. What to do, girl? God, what, saith she. The poor relation type of girl, all willingness to do without a fire in her room and content to do odd jobs and help dear cousin so-and-so. Nobody really wants her, except those people who can't keep their servants, and they treat her like a galley slave. So I became the court fool. Insolence, plain speaking, a dash of wit now and again, not too much, lest I should have to live up to it, and behind it all, a very shrewd observation of human nature. People rather like being told how horrible they really are. That's why they flock to popular preachers. It's been a great success. I'm always overwhelmed with invitations. I can live on my friends with the greatest ease, and I'm careful to make no pretence of gratitude. There's no one quite like you, Allegra. You don't mind in the least what you say. That's where you're wrong. I mind very much. I take care and thought about the matter. My seeming outspokenness is always calculated. I've got to be careful. This job has got to carry me on to old age. Why not marry? I know heaps of people who've asked you. Allegra's face grew suddenly hard. I can never marry. Because... Maisie left the sentence unfinished, looking at her friend. The latter gave a short nod of assent. Footsteps were heard on the stairs. The butler threw open the door and announced, "Mr. Seagrave." John came in without any particular enthusiasm. He couldn't imagine why the old boy had asked him. If he could have got out of it, he would have done so. The house depressed him with its solid magnificence and the soft pile of its carpet. A girl came forward and shook hands with him. He remembered vaguely having seen her one day in her father's office. How do you do, Mr. Seagrave? Mr. Seagrave? Miss Carr." Then he woke. Who was she? Where did she come from? From the flame-coloured draperies that floated round her to the tiny mercury wings on her small Greek head, she was a being transitory and fugitive, standing out against the dull background with an effect of unreality. Rudolph Wetterman came in, his broad expanse of gleaming shirt-front creaking as he walked. They went down informally to dinner. Allegra Carr talked to her host. John Seagrave had to devote himself to Maisie. But his whole mind was on the girl on the other side of him. She was marvellously effective. Her effectiveness was, he thought, more studied than natural. But behind all that, there lay something else. Flickering fire, fitful, capricious, like the will-o'-the-wisps that of old lured men into the marshes. At last he got a chance to speak to her. Maisie was giving her father a message from some friend she'd met that day. Now that the moment had come, he was tongue-tied. His glance pleaded with her dumbly. "Dinner-table topics," she said lightly. "Shall we start with the theatres, or with one of those innumerable openings beginning, 'Do you like—'" John laughed. "And if we find we both liked dogs and disliked sandy cats, it will form what is called a bond between us." "Assuredly," said Allegra gravely. "It is, I think, a pity to begin with a catechism. Yet it puts conversation within the reach of all. True, but with disastrous results. It is useful to know the rules, if only to break them." John smiled at her. "I take it, then, that you and I will indulge our personal vagaries, even though we display thereby the genius that is akin to madness." With a sharp, unguarded movement, the girl's hand swept a wineglass off the table. There was a tinkle of broken glass. Maisie and her father stopped talking. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wetterman. I'm throwing glasses on the floor." "My dear Allegra, doesn't matter at all. Not at all." Beneath his breath, John Seagrave said quickly, "Broken glass. That's bad luck. I wish it hadn't happened." "Don't worry. How does it go? 'Ill luck thou canst not bring where ill luck has its home.'" She turned once more to Wetterman. John, resuming conversation with Maisie, tried to place the quotation. He got it at last. They were the words used by Sieglinde in the Valkyrie when Sigmund offers to leave the house. He thought, did she mean? But Maisie was asking his opinion of the latest review. Soon he had admitted that he was fond of music. "After dinner," said Maisie, "we'll make Allegra play for us." They all went up to the drawing-room together. Secretly, Wetterman considered it a barbarous custom. He liked the ponderous gravity of the wine passing round, the handed cigars. But perhaps it was as well tonight. He didn't know what on earth he could find to say to young Seagrave. Maisie was too bad with her whims. It wasn't as though the fellow were good-looking, really good-looking, and certainly he wasn't amusing. He was glad when Maisie asked Allegra Carr to play. They'd get through the evening sooner. The young idiot didn't even play bridge. Allegra played well, though without the sure touch of a professional. She played modern music, Debussy and Strauss, a little Scriabin. Then she dropped into the first movement of Beethoven's Pathétique, that expression of a grief that is infinite, a sorrow that is endless and vast as the ages, but in which, from end to end, breathes the spirit that will not accept defeat. In the solemnity of undying woe, it moves with the rhythm of the conqueror to its final doom. Towards the end she faltered. Her fingers struck a discord, and she broke off abruptly. She looked across at Maisie and laughed mockingly. "You see," she said, "they won't let me." Then, without waiting for a reply to her somewhat enigmatical remark, she plunged into a strange, haunting melody, a thing of weird harmonies and curious measured rhythm, quite unlike anything Seagrave had ever heard before. It was delicate as the flight of a bird, poised, hovering. Suddenly, without the least warning, It turned into a mere discordant jangle of notes, and Allegra rose laughing from the piano. In spite of her laugh, she looked disturbed and almost frightened. She sat down by Maisie, and John heard the latter say in a low tone to her, "You shouldn't do it. You really shouldn't do it." "What was the last thing?" John asked eagerly. "Something of my own." She spoke sharply and curtly. Wetterman changed the subject. That night, John Seagrave dreamt again of the house. John was unhappy. His life was irksome to him, as never before. Up to now he accepted it patiently. A disagreeable necessity, but one which left his inner freedom essentially untouched. Now all that was changed. The outer world and the inner intermingled. He did not disguise to himself the reason for the change. He had fallen in love at first sight with Allegra Carr. What was he going to do about it? He'd been too bewildered that first night to make any plans. He'd not even tried to see her again. A little later, when Maisie Wetterman asked him down to her father's place in the country for the weekend, he went eagerly, but he was disappointed, for Allegra was not there. He mentioned her once, tentatively, to Maisie, and she told him that Allegra was up in Scotland paying a visit. He left it at that. He would have liked to go on talking about her, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. Maisie was puzzled by him that weekend. He didn't appear to see, well, to see what was so plainly to be seen. She was a direct young woman in her methods, but directness was lost upon John. He thought her kind, but a little overpowering. Yet the fates were stronger than Maisie. They willed that John should see Allegra again. They met in the park one Sunday afternoon. He had seen her from far off, and his heart thumped against the side of his ribs. Supposing she should have forgotten him. But she had not forgotten. She stopped and spoke. In a few minutes they were walking side by side, striking out across the grass. He was ridiculously happy. He said suddenly and unexpectedly, "Do you believe in dreams?" "I believe in nightmares." The harshness of her voice startled him. "Nightmares?" he said stupidly. I didn't mean nightmares." Allegra looked at him. "No," she said. "There have been no nightmares in your life. I can see that." Her voice was gentle, different. He told her then of his dream of the White House, stammering a little. He'd had it now 7 times, always the same. It was beautiful, so beautiful. He went on, "You see, it's to do with you, in some way. I had it first, the night before I met you." "To do with me?" She laughed, a short, bitter laugh. Oh no, that's impossible. The house was beautiful." "So are you," said John Seagrave. Allegra flushed a little with annoyance. "I'm sorry. I was stupid. I seemed to ask for a compliment, didn't I? But I didn't really mean that at all. The outside of me is all right, I know." "I haven't seen the inside of the house yet," said John Seagrave. "When I do, I know it will be quite as beautiful as the outside." He spoke slowly and gravely, giving the words a meaning that she chose to ignore. "There is something more I want to tell you, if you will listen." "I will listen," said Allegra. "I am chucking up this job of mine. I ought to have done it long ago, I see that now. I've been content to drift along, knowing I was an utter failure, without caring much, just living from day to day. A man shouldn't do that. It's a man's business to find something he can do and make a success of it. I'm chucking this and taking on something else, quite a different sort of thing. It's a kind of expedition in West Africa. I can't tell you the details. They're not supposed to be known, but if it comes off, well, I shall be a rich man." "So you, too, count success in terms of money?" "Money," said John Seagrave, "means just one thing to me. You." When I come back—" He paused. She bent her head. Her face had grown very pale. "I won't pretend to misunderstand. That's why I must tell you now, once and for all, I shall never marry." He stayed a little while, considering. Then he said very gently, "Can't you tell me why?" "I could, but more than anything in the world I do not want to tell you." Again he was silent. Then he looked up suddenly, and a singularly attractive smile illuminated his fawn's face. "I see," he said. "So you won't let me come inside the house? Not even to peep in for a second? The blinds are to stay down." Allegra leaned forward and laid her hand on his. "I will tell you this much. You dream of your house, but I don't dream. My dreams are nightmares." And on that she left him, abruptly, disconcertingly. That night, once more, he dreamed. Of late he had realized that the house was most certainly tenanted. He had seen a hand draw aside the blinds, had caught glimpses of moving figures within. Tonight the house seemed fairer than it had done ever before. Its white walls shone in the sunlight. The peace and the beauty of it were complete. Then suddenly he became aware of a fuller ripple of the waves of joy. He knew it. A hand, the same hand that he'd seen before, laid hold of the blind, drawing it back. In a minute he would see. He was awake, still quivering with the horror, the unutterable loathing of the thing that had looked out at him from the window of the house. It was a thing utterly and wholly horrible, a thing so vile and loathsome that the mere remembrance of it made him feel sick. And he knew that the most unutterably and horribly vile thing about it was its presence in that house, the house of beauty. For where that thing abode was horror. Horror that rose up and slew the peace and the serenity which were the birthright of the house. The beauty, the wonderful, immortal beauty of the house was destroyed forever, for within its holy, consecrated walls there dwelt the shadow of an unclean thing. If ever again he should dream of the house, Seagrave knew he would awake at once with a start of terror, lest from its white beauty that thing might suddenly look out at him. The following evening, when he left the office, he went straight to Wetterman's house. He must see Allegra Carr. Maisie would tell him where she was to be found. He never noticed the eager light that flashed into Maisie's eyes as he was shown in, and she jumped up to greet him. He stammered out his request at once, with her hand still in his. "Miss Carr, I met her yesterday, but I don't know where she's staying." He did not feel Maisie's hand grow limp in his as she withdrew it. The sudden coldness of her voice told him nothing. "Allegra is here, staying with us, but I'm afraid you can't see her. But, you see, her mother died this morning. We've just had the news." "Oh." He was taken aback. "It's all very sad," said Maisie. She hesitated just a minute, then went on. "You see, she died in, well, practically an asylum. There's insanity in the family. The grandfather shot himself, and one of Allegra's aunts is a hopeless imbecile, and another drowned herself." John Seagrave made an inarticulate sound. "I thought I ought to tell you," said Maisie virtuously. "We're such friends, aren't we? And of course Allegra is very attractive. Lots of people have asked her to marry them, but naturally she won't marry at all. Well, she couldn't, could she?" "She's all right," said Seagrave. "There's nothing wrong with her." His voice sounded hoarse and unnatural in his own ears. "One never knows. Her mother was quite all right when she was young. And she wasn't just peculiar, you know. She was quite raving mad. It's a dreadful thing, insanity." "Yes," he said. "It's the most awful thing." He knew now what it was that had looked at him from the window of the house. Maisie was still talking on. He interrupted her brusquely. I really came here to say goodbye and to thank you for all your kindness." "You're not going away?" There was alarm in her voice. He smiled sideways at her, a crooked smile, pathetic and attractive. "Yes," he said, "to Africa." "Africa?" Maisie echoed the word blankly. Before she could pull herself together, he'd shaken her by the hand and gone. She was left standing there, her hands clenched by her sides, an angry spot of colour in each cheek. Below, on the doorstep, John Seagrave came face to face with Allegra coming in from the street. She was in black, her face white and lifeless. She took one glance at him, then drew him into a small morning room. "Maisie told you," she said. "You know." He nodded. "But what does it matter? You're all right. It leaves some people out." She looked at him somberly, mournfully. "You are all right," he repeated. "I don't know." She almost whispered it. "I don't know. I told you about my dreams, and when I'm at the piano, those others come and take hold of my hands." He was staring at her, paralysed. For one instant, as she spoke, something looked out from her eyes. It was gone in a flash, but he knew it. It was the thing that had looked out from the house. She caught his momentary recoil. "You see," she whispered. "You see. But I wish Maisie hadn't told you. It takes everything from you." "Everything?" "Yes. There won't even be dreams left. For now, you'll never dare to dream of the house again." The West African sun poured down. The heat was intense. John Seagrave continued to moan. "I can't find it. I can't find it." The little English doctor with the red head and the tremendous jaw scowled down upon his patient in that bullying manner which he'd made his own.
Oh, he's always saying that. What does it mean?"
"He speaks, I think, of a house, monsieur." The soft-voiced Sister of Charity from the Roman Catholic mission spoke with her gentle detachment, as she too looked down on the stricken man.
"A house, eh? Well, he's got to get it out of his head, or we shan't pull him through. It's on his mind. Seagrave! Seagrave!"
The wandering attention was fixed. The eyes rested with recognition on the doctor's face.
"Look here. You're going to pull through. I'm going to pull you through, but you've got to stop worrying about this house. It can't run away, you know, so don't bother about looking for it now."
"All right." He seemed obedient. "I suppose it can't very well run away if it's never been there at all."
"Of course not."
The doctor laughed his cheery laugh.
"Now you'll be all right in no time."
And with a boisterous bluntness of manner, he took his departure. Seagrave lay thinking. The fever had abated for the moment, and he could think clearly and lucidly. He must find that house. For 10 years he had dreaded finding it. The thought that he might come upon it unawares had been his greatest terror. And then he remembered, when his fears were quite lulled to rest, that one day it had found him. He recalled clearly his first haunting terror, then his sudden, his exquisite relief. For after all, the house was empty. Quite empty, and exquisitely peaceful. It was as he remembered it 10 years before. He'd not forgotten. There was a huge black furniture van moving slowly away from the house. The last tenant, of course, moving out with his goods. He went up to the men in charge of the van and spoke to them. There was something rather sinister about that van. It was so very black. The horses were black too, with free-flowing manes and tails, and all the men wore black clothes and gloves. It reminded him of something else, something he couldn't remember. Yes, he had been quite right. The last tenant was moving out, as his lease was up. The house was to stand empty for the present until the owner came back from abroad, and waking, he had been full of the peaceful beauty of the empty house. A month after that, he had received a letter from Maisie. She wrote to him perseveringly once a month. In it she told him that Allegra Carr had died in the same home as her mother, and wasn't it dreadfully sad? Though, of course, a merciful release. It really had been very odd indeed. Coming after his dream like that, he didn't quite understand it all, but it was odd. And the worst of it was that he'd never been able to find the house since. Somehow he'd forgotten the way. The fever began to take hold of him once more. He tossed restlessly. Of course, he'd forgotten. The house was on high ground. He must climb to get there. But it was hot work, climbing cliffs, dreadfully hot. Up, up, up. Oh! He had slipped. He must start again from the bottom. Up, up, up. Days passed, weeks. He wasn't sure that years didn't go by, and he was still climbing. Once he heard the doctor's voice, but he couldn't stop climbing to listen. Besides, the doctor would tell him to leave off looking for the house. He thought it was an ordinary house. He didn't know. He remembered suddenly that he must be calm, very calm. You couldn't find the house unless you were very calm. It was no use looking for the house in a hurry or being excited. If he could only keep calm. But it was so hot. Hot? It was cold. Yes, cold. These weren't cliffs, they were icebergs. Jagged, cold icebergs. He was so tired. He wouldn't go on looking. It was no good. Ah, here was a lane. That was better than icebergs, anyway. How pleasant and shady it was in the cool green lane. And those trees, they were splendid. They were rather like... what? He couldn't remember, but it didn't matter. Ah, here were flowers, all golden and blue. How lovely it all was. And how strangely familiar. Of course he'd been here before. There, through the trees, was the gleam of the house, standing on the high ground. How beautiful it was. The green lane, and the trees, and the flowers were as nothing to the paramount, the all-satisfying beauty of the house. He hastened his steps. To think he had never yet been inside. How unbelievably stupid of him, when he had the key in his pocket all the time. And of course the beauty of the exterior was as nothing to the beauty that lay within, especially now that the owner had come back from abroad. He mounted the steps to the great door. Cruel, strong hands were dragging him back. They fought him, dragging him to and fro, backwards and forwards. The doctor was shaking him, roaring in his ear, "Hold on, man! You can! Don't let go! Don't let go!" His eyes were alight with the fierceness of one who sees an enemy. Seagrave wondered who the enemy was. The black-robed nun was praying. That too was strange. And all he wanted was to be left alone, to go back to the house, for every minute the house was growing fainter. That, of course, was because the doctor was so strong. He wasn't strong enough to fight the doctor, if only he could. But stop. There was another way. The way dreams went in the moment of waking. No strength could stop them. They just flitted past. The doctor's hands wouldn't be able to hold him if he slipped, just slipped. Yes, that was the way. The white walls were visible once more. The doctor's voice was fainter. His hands were barely felt. He knew now how dreams laugh when they give you the slip. He was at the door of the house. The exquisite stillness was unbroken. He put the key in the lock and turned it. Just a moment he waited, to realize to the full the perfect, the ineffable, the all-satisfying completeness of joy. Then he passed over the threshold.
The Lonely God. He stood on a shelf in the British Museum, alone and forlorn amongst a company of obviously more important deities. Ranged round the four walls, these greater personages all seemed to display an overwhelming sense of their own superiority. The pedestal of each was duly inscribed with the land and race that had been proud to possess him. There was no doubt of their position. They were divinities of importance, and recognized as such. Only the little god in the corner was aloof and remote from their company. Roughly hewn out of grey stone, his features almost totally obliterated by time and exposure, he sat there in isolation, his elbows on his knees and his head buried in his hands. A lonely little god in a strange country. There was no inscription to tell the land whence he came. He was indeed lost, without honour or renown, a pathetic little figure very far from home. No one noticed him, no one stopped to look at him. Why should they? He was so insignificant, a block of grey stone in a corner. On either side of him were two Mexican gods, worn smooth with age, placid idols with folded hands and cruel mouths curved in a smile that showed openly their contempt of humanity. There was also a rotund, violently self-assertive little god with a clenched fist, who evidently suffered from a swollen sense of his own importance, but passers-by stopped to give him a glance sometimes, even if it was only to laugh at the contrast of his absurd pomposity with the smiling indifference of his Mexican companions. And the little lost god sat on there hopelessly, his head in his hands, as he had sat year in and year out, till one day the impossible happened, and he found a worshipper. "Any letters for me?" The hall porter removed a packet of letters from a pigeonhole, gave a cursory glance through them, and said in a wooden voice, "Nothing for you, sir." Frank Oliver sighed as he walked out of the club again. There was no particular reason why there should have been anything for him. Very few people wrote to him. Ever since he had returned from Burma in the spring, he had become conscious of a growing and increasing loneliness. Frank Oliver was a man just over 40, and the last 18 years of his life had been spent in various parts of the globe, with brief furloughs in England. Now that he had retired and come home to live for good, he realized for the first time how very much alone in the world he was. True, there was his sister Greta, married to a Yorkshire clergyman, very busy with parochial duties and the bringing up of a family of small children. Greta was naturally very fond of her only brother, but equally naturally she had very little time to give him. Then there was his old friend, Tom Hurley. Tom was married to a nice, bright, cheerful girl, very energetic and practical, of whom Frank was secretly afraid. She told him brightly that he must not be a crabbed old bachelor, and was always producing nice girls. Frank Oliver found that he never had anything to say to these nice girls. They persevered with him for a while, then gave him up as hopeless. And yet he was not really unsociable. He had a great longing for companionship and sympathy, and ever since he had been back in England he had become aware of a growing discouragement. He had been away too long. He was out of tune with the times. He spent long, aimless days wandering about, wondering what on earth he was to do with himself next. It was on one of these days that he strolled into the British Museum. He was interested in Asiatic curiosities, and so it was that he chanced upon the Lonely God. Its charm held him at once. Here was something vaguely akin to himself. Here, too, was someone lost and astray in a strange land. He became in the habit of paying frequent visits to the museum, just to glance in on the little grey stone figure, in its obscure place on the high shelf. Rough luck on the little chap, he thought to himself. Probably had a lot of fuss made about him once, kowtowing and offerings and all the rest of it. He had begun to feel such a proprietary right in his little friend, it really almost amounted to a sense of actual ownership, that he was inclined to be resentful when he found that the little god had made a second conquest. He had discovered the lonely god. Nobody else, he felt, had a right to interfere. But after the first flash of indignation, he was forced to smile at himself, for this second worshipper was such a little bit of a thing, such a ridiculous, pathetic creature in a shabby black coat and skirt that had seen its best days. She was young, a little over 20, he should judge, with fair hair and blue eyes, and a wistful droop to her mouth. Her hat especially appealed to his chivalry. She had evidently trimmed it herself, and it made such a brave attempt to be smart that its failure was pathetic. She was obviously a lady, though a poverty-stricken one, and he immediately decided in his own mind that she was a governess, and alone in the world. He soon found out that her days for visiting the god were Tuesdays and Fridays, and she always arrived at 10 o'clock as soon as the museum was open. At first he disliked her intrusion, but little by little it began to form one of the principal interests of his monotonous life. Indeed, the fellow devotee was fast ousting the object of devotion from his position of preeminence. The days that he did not see the little lonely lady, as he called her to himself, were blank. Perhaps she, too, was equally interested in him, though she endeavoured to conceal the fact with studious unconcern. But little by little a sense of fellowship was slowly growing between them, though as yet they had exchanged no spoken word. The truth of the matter was, the man was too shy. He argued to himself that very likely she had not even noticed him. Some inner sense gave the lie to that instantly, that she would consider it a great impertinence, and finally, that he had not the least idea what to say. But fate, or the little god, was kind, and sent him an inspiration, or what he regarded as such. With infinite delight in his own cunning, he purchased a woman's handkerchief, a frail little affair of cambric and lace, which he almost feared to touch, and, thus armed, he followed her as she departed, and stopped her in the Egyptian room. "Excuse me, but is this yours?" He tried to speak with airy unconcern, and signally failed. The lonely lady took it and made a pretence of examining it with minute care. "No, it is not mine." She handed it back and added, with what he felt guiltily was a suspicious glance, "It's quite a new one. The price is still on it." But he was unwilling to admit that he had been found out. He started on an over-plausible flow of explanation. "You see, I picked it up under that big case. It was just by the farthest leg of it." He derived great relief from this detailed account. "So, as you had been standing there, I thought it must be yours and came after you with it." She said again, "No, it isn't mine," and added as if with a sense of ungraciousness, "Thank you." The conversation came to an awkward standstill. The girl stood there, pink and embarrassed, evidently uncertain how to retreat with dignity. He made a desperate effort to take advantage of his opportunity. I didn't know there was anyone else in London who cared for our little lonely god till you came." She answered eagerly, forgetting her reserve. "Do you call him that too?" Apparently, if she had noticed his pronoun, she did not resent it. She had been startled into sympathy, and his quiet, "Of course," seemed the most natural rejoinder in the world. Again there was a silence, but this time it was a silence born of understanding. It was the lonely lady who broke it in a sudden remembrance of the conventionalities. She drew herself up to her full height, and with an almost ridiculous assumption of dignity for so small a person, she observed in chilling accents, "I must be going now. Good morning." And with a slight, stiff inclination of her head, she walked away, holding herself very erect. By all acknowledged standards, Frank Oliver ought to have felt rebuffed. But it is a regrettable sign of his rapid advance in depravity that he merely murmured to himself, "Little darling." He was soon to repent of his temerity, however. For 10 days his little lady never came near the museum. He was in despair. He had frightened her away. She would never come back. He was a brute, a villain. He would never see her again. In his distress, he haunted the British Museum all day long. She might merely have changed her time of coming. He soon began to know the adjacent rooms by heart, and he contracted a lasting hatred of mummies. The Guardian policeman observed him with suspicion when he spent 3 hours poring over Assyrian hieroglyphics, and the contemplation of endless vases of all ages nearly drove him mad with boredom. But one day his patience was rewarded. She came again, rather pinker than usual, and trying hard to appear self-possessed. He greeted her with cheerful friendliness. "Good morning. It is ages since you've been here." "Good morning." She let the words slip out with icy frigidity, and coldly ignored the end part of his sentence. But he was desperate. "Look here." He stood confronting her with pleading eyes that reminded her irresistibly of a large, faithful dog. "Won't you be friends? I'm all alone in London, all alone in the world, and I believe you are too. We ought to be friends. Besides, our little god has introduced us." She looked up half doubtfully, but there was a faint smile quivering at the corners of her mouth. "Has he?" "Of course." It was the second time he had used this extremely positive form of assurance, and now, as before, it did not fail of its effect. For after a minute or two the girl said, in that slightly royal manner of hers, "Very well." "That's splendid," he replied gruffly. But there was something in his voice as he said it that made the girl glance at him swiftly, with a sharp impulse of pity. And so the queer friendship began. Twice a week they met at the shrine of a little heathen idol. At first they confined their conversation solely to him. He was, as it were, at once a palliation of, and an excuse for, their friendship. The question of his origin was widely discussed. The man insisted on attributing to him the most bloodthirsty characteristics. He depicted him as the terror and dread of his native land, insatiable for human sacrifice, and bowed down to by his people in fear and trembling. In the contrast between his former greatness and his present insignificance there lay, according to the man, all the pathos of the situation. The lonely lady would have none of this theory. He was essentially a kind little god, she insisted. She doubted whether he had ever been very powerful. If he had been so, she argued, he would not now be lost and friendless, and anyway, he was a dear little god, and she loved him, and she hated to think of him sitting there day after day, with all those other horrid, supercilious things jeering at him, because you could see they did. After this vehement outburst, the little lady was quite out of breath. That topic exhausted, they naturally began to talk of themselves. He found out that his surmise was correct. She was a nursery governess to a family of children who lived at Hampstead. She conceived an instant dislike of these children, of Ted, who was 5, and really not naughty, only mischievous, of the twins, who were rather trying, and of Molly, who wouldn't do anything she was told, but was such a dear you couldn't be cross with her. "Those children bully you," he said grimly and accusingly to her. "They do not," she retorted with spirit. "I am extremely stern with them." "Oh, ye gods!" he laughed. But she made him apologize humbly for his scepticism. She was an orphan, she told him, quite alone in the world. Gradually he told her something of his own life, of his official life, which had been painstaking and mildly successful, and of his unofficial pastime, which was the spoiling of yards of canvas. "Of course, I don't know anything about it," he explained, "but I have always felt I could paint something some day. I can sketch pretty decently, but I'd like to do a real picture of something. A chap who knew once told me that my technique wasn't bad." She was interested, pressed for details. "I am sure you paint awfully well." He shook his head. "No. I've begun several things lately and chucked them up in despair. I always thought that, when I had the time, it would be plain sailing. I've been storing up that idea for years, but now, like everything else, I suppose, I've left it too late." "Nothing's too late. Ever," said the little lady with the vehement earnestness of the very young. He smiled down at her. "You think not, child? It's too late for some things for me. and the little lady laughed at him and nicknamed him Methuselah. They were beginning to feel curiously at home in the British Museum. The solid and sympathetic policeman who patrolled the galleries was a man of tact, and on the appearance of the couple he usually found that his onerous duties of guardianship were urgently needed in the adjoining Assyrian room. One day the man took a bold step. He invited her out to tea. At first she demurred. "I have no time. I am not free. I can come some mornings because the children have French lessons."
"Nonsense," said the man. "You could manage one day. Kill off an aunt or a second cousin or something, but come! We'll go to a little ABC shop near here and have buns for tea. I know you must love buns."
"Yes, the penny kind with currants."
"And a lovely glaze on top."
"They are such plump, dear things."
"There is something," Frank Oliver said solemnly, "infinitely comforting about a bun."
So it was arranged, and the little governess came, wearing quite an expensive hothouse rose in her belt in honour of the occasion. He had noticed that, of late, she had a strained, worried look, and it was more apparent than ever this afternoon as she poured out the tea at the little marble-topped table.
"Children been bothering you?"
he asked solicitously. She shook her head. She had seemed curiously disinclined to talk about the children lately. "They're all right. I never mind them."
"Don't you?"
His sympathetic tone seemed to distress her unwarrantably. "Oh, no, it was never that. But indeed I was lonely. I was indeed." Her tone was almost pleading. He said quickly, touched,
Yes, child, I know. I know."
After a minute's pause, he remarked in a cheerful tone,
"Do you know, you haven't even asked my name yet."
She held up a protesting hand. "Please, I don't want to know it. And don't ask mine. Let us be just two lonely people who've come together and made friends. It makes it so much more wonderful and different."
He said slowly and thoughtfully, "Very well. In an otherwise lonely world, we'll be two people who have just each other."
It was a little different from her way of putting it, and she seemed to find it difficult to go on with the conversation. Instead, she bent lower and lower over her plate, till only the crown of her hat was visible.
"That's rather a nice hat," he said by way of restoring her equanimity.
"I trimmed it myself," she informed him proudly.
"I thought so the moment I saw it,"
he answered, saying the wrong thing with cheerful ignorance. "I'm afraid it is not as fashionable as I meant it to be."
"I think it's a perfectly lovely hat," he said loyally.
Again constraint settled down upon them. Frank Oliver broke the silence bravely.
"Little lady, I didn't mean to tell you yet, but I can't help it. I love you. I want you. I loved you from the first moment I saw you standing there in your little black suit. Dearest, if two lonely people were together, why, there would be no more loneliness. And I'd work. Oh, how I'd work. I'd paint you. I know I could. Oh, my little girl, I can't live without you. I can't indeed."
His little lady was looking at him very steadily, but what she said was quite the last thing he expected her to say. Very quietly and distinctly she said, "You bought that handkerchief." He was amazed at this proof of feminine perspicacity, and still more amazed at her remembering it against him now. Surely, after this lapse of time, it might have been forgiven him.
"Yes, I did," he acknowledged humbly. "I wanted an excuse to speak to you. Are you very angry?"
He waited meekly for her words of condemnation. "I think it was sweet of you," cried the little lady with vehemence. "Just sweet of you." Her voice ended uncertainly.
Frank Oliver went on in his gruff tone, "Tell me, child, is it impossible? I know I'm an ugly, rough old fellow."
The lonely lady interrupted him. "No, you're not. I wouldn't have you different, not in any way. I love you just as you are, do you understand? Not because I'm sorry for you, not because I'm alone in the world and want someone to be fond of me and take care of me, but because you're just you. Now do you understand?"
"Is it true?"
he asked, half in a whisper. And she answered steadily, "Yes, it's true." The wonder of it
overpowered them. At last he said whimsically, "So we've fallen upon heaven, dearest." "In an ABC shop," she answered in a voice that held tears and laughter. But terrestrial heavens are short-lived. The little lady started up with an exclamation. "I'd no idea how late it was. I must go at once." "I'll see you home." "No, no, no!" He was forced to yield to her insistence, and merely accompanied her as far as the tube station. "Goodbye, dearest." She clung to his hand with an intensity that he remembered afterwards. "Only goodbye till tomorrow," he answered cheerfully. 10 o'clock as usual, and we'll tell each other our names and our histories, and be frightfully practical and prosaic. Goodbye to heaven, though," she whispered. "It will be with us always, sweetheart." She smiled back at him, but with that same sad appeal that disquieted him, and which he could not fathom. Then the relentless lift dragged her down out of sight. He was strangely disturbed by those last words of hers, but he put them resolutely out of his mind and substituted radiant anticipations of tomorrow in their stead. At 10 o'clock he was there, in the accustomed place. For the first time he noticed how malevolently the other idols looked down upon him. It almost seemed as if they were possessed of some secret, evil knowledge affecting him, over which they were gloating. He was uneasily aware of their dislike. The little lady was late. Why didn't she come? The atmosphere of this place was getting on his nerves. Never had his own little friend, their God, seemed so hopelessly impotent as today, a helpless lump of stone, hugging his own despair. His cogitations were interrupted by a small, sharp-faced boy who had stepped up to him and was earnestly scrutinizing him from head to foot. Apparently satisfied with the result of his observations, he held out a letter. "For me?" It had no superscription. He took it, and the sharp boy decamped with extraordinary rapidity. Frank Oliver read the letter slowly and unbelievingly. It was quite short. "Dearest, I can never marry you. Please forget that I ever came into your life at all, and try to forgive me if I have hurt you. Don't try to find me, because it will be no good. It is really goodbye. The Lonely Lady." There was a postscript, which had evidently been scribbled at the last moment. "I do love you. I do indeed." And that little impulsive postscript was all the comfort he had in the weeks that followed. Needless to say, he disobeyed her injunction not to try to find her, but all in vain. She had vanished completely, and he had no clue to trace her by. He advertised despairingly, imploring her in veiled terms at least to explain the mystery, but blank silence rewarded his efforts. She was gone, never to return. And then it was that for the first time in his life he really began to paint. His technique had always been good. Now craftsmanship and inspiration went hand in hand. The picture that made his name and brought him renown was accepted and hung in the Academy, and was accounted to be the picture of the year, no less for the exquisite treatment of the subject than for the masterly workmanship and technique. A certain amount of mystery, too, rendered it more interesting to the general outside public. His inspiration had come quite by chance. A fairy story in a magazine had taken a hold on his imagination. It was the story of a fortunate princess who had always had everything she wanted. Did she express a wish, it was instantly gratified. A desire, it was granted. She had a devoted father and mother, great riches, beautiful clothes and jewels, slaves to wait upon her and fulfill her lightest whim, laughing maidens to bear her company, all that the heart of a princess could desire. The handsomest and richest princes paid her court, and sued in vain for her hand, and were willing to kill any number of dragons to prove their devotion. And yet the loneliness of the princess was greater than that of the poorest beggar in the land. He read no more. The ultimate fate of the princess interested him not at all. A picture had risen up before him of the pleasure-laden princess with a sad, solitary soul, surfeited with happiness, suffocated with luxury, starving in the palace of plenty. He began painting with furious energy. The fierce joy of creation possessed him. He represented the princess surrounded by her court, reclining on a divan. A riot of Eastern colour pervaded the picture. The princess wore a marvellous gown of strange-coloured embroideries. Her golden hair fell round her, and on her head was a heavy, jewelled circlet. Her maidens surrounded her, and princes knelt at her feet, bearing rich gifts. The whole scene was one of luxury and richness. But the face of the princess was turned away. She was oblivious of the laughter and mirth around her. Her gaze was fixed on a dark and shadowy corner, where stood a seemingly incongruous object, a little grey stone idol, with its head buried in its hand in a quaint abandonment of despair. Was it so incongruous? The eyes of the young princess rested on it with a strange sympathy, as though a dawning sense of her own isolation drew her glance irresistibly. They were akin, these two. The world was at her feet, yet she was alone. A lonely princess, looking at a lonely little god. All London talked of this picture, and Greta wrote a few hurried words of congratulation from Yorkshire, and Tom Hurley's wife besought Frank Oliver to come for a weekend and meet a really delightful girl, a great admirer of your work. Frank Oliver laughed once sardonically and threw the letter into the fire. Success had come. But what was the use of it? He only wanted one thing, that little lonely lady who had gone out of his life forever. It was Ascot Cup Day, and the policeman on duty in a certain section of the British Museum rubbed his eyes and wondered if he were dreaming, for one does not expect to see there an Ascot vision in a lace frock and a marvellous hat, a veritable nymph as imagined by Parisian genius. The policeman stared in rapturous admiration. The lonely god was not perhaps so surprised. He may have been in his way a powerful little god. At any rate, here was one worshipper brought back to the fold. The little lonely lady was staring up at him, and her lips moved in a rapid whisper. "Dear little god, oh dear little god, please help me. Oh, please do help me." Perhaps the little god was flattered. Perhaps, if he was indeed the ferocious, unappeasable deity Frank Oliver had imagined him, the long, weary years and the march of civilization had softened his cold, stone heart. Perhaps the lonely lady had been right all along, and he was really a kind little god. Perhaps it was merely a coincidence. However that may be, it was at that very moment that Frank Oliver walked slowly and sadly through the door of the Assyrian room. He raised his head and saw the Parisian nymph. In another moment his arm was round her, and she was stammering out rapid, broken words. "I was so lonely. You know, you must have read that story I wrote. You couldn't have painted that picture unless you had, and unless you had understood. The princess was I. I had everything, and yet I was lonely beyond words. One day I was going to a fortune-teller's, and I borrowed my maid's clothes. I came in here on the way and saw you, looking at the little god. That's how it all began. I pretended. Oh, it was hateful of me, and I went on pretending, and afterwards I didn't dare confess that I had told you such dreadful lies. I thought you would be disgusted at the way I had deceived you. I couldn't bear you to find out, so I went away. Then I wrote that story, and yesterday I saw your picture. It was your picture, wasn't it?" Only the gods really know the word ingratitude. It is to be presumed that the lonely little god knew the black ingratitude of human nature. As a divinity he had unique opportunities of observing it, yet in the hour of trial he who had had sacrifices innumerable offered to him made sacrifice in his turn. He sacrificed his only two worshippers in a strange land, and it showed him to be a great little god in his way, since he sacrificed all that he had. Through the chinks in his fingers he watched them go, hand in hand, without a backward glance. Two happy people who had found heaven, and had no need of him any longer. What was he, after all, but a very lonely little god in a strange land? Manx Gold. Old Mulcrane lived up on the brow, where Furby slopes down to the wold. His croft was all golden with cushag and furs, his daughter was fair to behold. "Oh, father," they say, "you've plenty of store, but hidden all out of the way. No gold can I see, but it's glint on the gorse. Then what have you done with it, pray?" "My gold is locked up in a coffer of oak, which I dropped in the tide, and it sank, and there it lies fixed like an anchor of hope, all bright and as safe as the bank." "I like that song," I said appreciatively, as Fenella finished. "You should do," said Fenella. "It's about our ancestor, yours and mine, Uncle Miles's grandfather. He made a fortune out of smuggling and hid it somewhere, and no one ever knew where." Ancestry is Fenella's strong point. She takes an interest in all her forebears. My tendencies are strictly modern. The difficult present and the uncertain future absorb all my energy. But I like hearing Fenella singing old Manx ballads. Fenella is very charming. She's my first cousin, and also, from time to time, my fiancée. In moods of financial optimism, we are engaged. When a corresponding wave of pessimism sweeps over us, and we realize that we shall not be able to marry for at least 10 years, we break it off. "Didn't anyone ever try to find the treasure?" I inquired. "Of course, but they never did. Perhaps they didn't look scientifically." "Uncle Miles had a jolly good try," said Fenella. "He said anyone with intelligence ought to be able to solve a little problem like that." That sounded to me very like our Uncle Miles, a cranky and eccentric old gentleman who lived in the Isle of Man, and who was much given to didactic pronouncements. It was at that moment that the post came, and the letter. "Good heavens!" cried Fenella. "Talk of the devil! I mean, angels! Uncle Miles is dead." Both she and I had only seen our eccentric relative on 2 occasions, so we could neither of us pretend to a very deep grief. The letter was from a firm of lawyers in Douglas, and it informed us that under the will of Mr. Miles Mulcrane, deceased, Fenella and I were joint inheritors of his estate, which consisted of a house near Douglas and an infinitesimal income. Enclosed was a sealed envelope, which Mr. Mulcrane had directed should be forwarded to Fenella at his death. This letter we opened, and read its surprising contents. I reproduce it in full, since it was a truly characteristic document. "My dear Fenella and Juan, for I take it that where one of you is, the other will not be far away, or so gossip has whispered. You may remember having heard me say that anyone displaying a little intelligence could easily find the treasure concealed by my amiable scoundrel of a grandfather. I displayed that intelligence, and my reward was 4 chests of solid gold. Quite like a fairy story, is it not? Of living relations I have only 4. You 2, my nephew Ewan Corjeg, whom I have always heard is a thoroughly bad lot, and a cousin, a Dr. Fail, of whom I have heard very little, and that little not always good. My estate proper I am leaving to you and Fenella, but I feel a certain obligation laid upon me with regard to this treasure, which has fallen to my lot solely through my own ingenuity. My amiable ancestor would not, I feel, be satisfied for me to pass it on tamely by inheritance, so I, in my turn, have devised a little problem. There are still 4 chests of treasure, though in a more modern form than gold ingots or coins, and there are to be 4 competitors, my 4 living relations. It would be fairest to assign 1 chest to each, but the world, my children, is not fair. The race is to the swiftest, and often to the most unscrupulous. Who am I to go against nature? You must pit your wits against the other 2. There will be, I fear, very little chance for you. Goodness and innocence are seldom rewarded in this world. So strongly do I feel this, that I have deliberately cheated. Unfairness again, you notice. This letter goes to you 24 hours in advance of the letters to the other 2. Thus you will have a very good chance of securing the first treasure. 24 hours start, if you have any brains at all, ought to be sufficient. The clues for finding this treasure are to be found at my house in Douglas. The clues for the second treasure will not be released till the first treasure is found. In the second and succeeding cases, therefore, you will all start even. You have my good wishes for success. and nothing would please me better than for you to acquire all 4 chests, but for the reasons which I have already stated, I think that most unlikely. Remember that no scruples will stand in dear Ewan's way. Do not make the mistake of trusting him in any respect. As to Dr. Richard Fale, I know little about him, but he is, I fancy, a dark horse. Good luck to you both, but with little hopes of your success. Your affectionate uncle, Miles Mulcrane. As we reached the signature, Fenella made a leap from my side. "What is it?" I cried. Fenella was rapidly turning the pages of an ABC. "We must get to the Isle of Man as soon as possible," she cried. "How dare he say we were good and innocent and stupid? I'll show him. 1, we're going to find all 4 of these chests and get married and live happily ever afterwards with Rolls-Royces and footmen and marble baths. But we must get to the Isle of Man at once." It was 24 hours later. We had arrived in Douglas, interviewed the lawyers, and were now at Morhold House, facing Mrs. Skillicorn, our late uncle's housekeeper, a somewhat formidable woman who nevertheless relented a little before Fenella's eagerness. "Queer ways he had," she said, "liked to set everyone puzzling and contriving." "But the clues," cried Fenella. "The clues?" Deliberately, as she did everything, Mrs. Skillicorn left the room. She returned after an absence of some minutes and held out a folded piece of paper. We unfolded it eagerly. It contained a doggerel rhyme in my uncle's crabbed handwriting. 4 points of the compass so there be, south and west, north and east. East winds are bad for man and beast. Go south and west and north, not east. "Oh," said Fenella blankly. "Oh," said I, with much the same intonation. Mrs. Skillicorn smiled on us with gloomy relish. "Not much sense to it, is there?" she said helpfully. I don't see how to begin," said Fenella piteously. "Beginning," I said with a cheerfulness I did not feel, "is always the difficulty. Once we get going—" Mrs. Skillicorn smiled more grimly than ever. She was a depressing woman. "Can't you help us?" asked Fenella coaxingly. "I know nothing about the silly business. Didn't confide in me, your uncle didn't. I have told him to put his money in the bank and no nonsense. I never knew what he was up to." "He never went out with any chests, or anything of that kind?" "That he didn't." "You don't know when he hid the stuff, whether it was lately or long ago?" Mrs. Skillicorn shook her head. "Well," I said, trying to rally, "there are 2 possibilities. Either the treasure is hidden here, in the actual grounds, or else it may be hidden anywhere on the island. It depends on the bulk, of course." A sudden brainwave occurred to Fenella. "You haven't noticed anything missing," she said. "Among my uncle's things, I mean?" "Why, no. It's odd you're saying that." "You have, then?" "As I say, it's odd you're saying that. Snuff-boxes. There's at least 4 of them. I can't lay my hand on anywhere." "4 of them?" cried Fenella. "That must be it. We're on the track. Let's go out in the garden and look about." "There's nothing there," said Mrs. Skillicorn. "I'd know if there were. Your uncle couldn't have buried anything in the garden without my knowing about it." "Points of the compass are mentioned," I said. "The first thing we need is a map of the island." "There's one on that desk," said Mrs. Skillicorn. Fenella unfolded it eagerly. Something fluttered out as she did so. I caught it. "Hello," I said. "This looks like a further clue." We both went over it eagerly. It appeared to be a rude kind of map. There was a cross on it, and a circle, and a pointing arrow, and directions were roughly indicated, but it was hardly illuminating. We studied it in silence. "It's not very illuminating, is it?" said Fenella. "Naturally, it wants puzzling over," I said. "We can't expect it to leap to the eye." Mrs. Skillicorn interrupted with a suggestion of supper, to which we agreed thankfully. "And could we have some coffee?" said Fenella. "Lots of it. Very black." Mrs. Skillicorn provided us with an excellent meal, and at its conclusion a large jug of coffee made its appearance. "And now," said Fenella, "we must get down to it." "The first thing," I said, is direction. This seems to point clearly to the northeast of the island. It seems so. Let's look at the map. We studied the map attentively. It all depends on how you take the thing, said Fenella. Does the cross represent the treasure, or is it something like a church? There really ought to be rules. That would make it too easy. I suppose it would. Why are there little lines one side of the circle and not the other? I don't know. Are there any more maps anywhere? We were sitting in the library. There were several excellent maps. There were also various guidebooks descriptive of the island. There was a book on folklore. There was a book on the history of the island. We read them all, and at last we formed a possible theory. It does seem to fit, said Fenella at last. I mean, the two together is a likely conjunction which doesn't seem to occur anywhere else. It's worth trying anyhow, I said. I don't think we can do anything more tonight. Tomorrow, first thing, we'll hire a car and go off and try our luck. It's tomorrow now, said Fenella. 2:30. Just fancy. Early morning saw us on the road. We had hired a car for a week, arranging to drive it ourselves. Fenella's spirits rose as we sped along the excellent road, mile after mile. If only it wasn't for the other two, what fun this would be, she said. This is where the Derby was originally run, wasn't it? Before it was changed to Epsom? How queer that is to think of. I drew her attention to a farmhouse. That must be where there is said to be a secret passage running under the sea to that island. What fun! I love secret passages, don't you? Oh, Juan, we're getting quite near now. I'm terribly excited. If we should be right! 5 minutes later we abandoned the car. Everything's in the right position, said Fenella tremulously. We walked on. 6 of them. That's right. Now between these two, have you got the compass? 5 minutes later we were standing facing each other, an incredulous joy on our faces, and on my outstretched palm lay an antique snuff-box. We had been successful. On our return to Moorhold House, Mrs. Skillicorn met us with the information that 2 gentlemen had arrived. One had departed again, but the other was in the library. A tall, fair man with a florid face rose smilingly from an armchair as we entered the room. "Mr. Farricker and Miss Mulcrane, delighted to meet you. I am your distant cousin, Dr. Fayle. Amusing game, all this, isn't it?" His manner was urbane and pleasant, but I took an immediate dislike to him. I felt that in some way the man was dangerous. His pleasant manner was somehow too pleasant, and his eyes never met yours fairly. "I'm afraid we've got bad news for you," I said. "Miss Mulcrane and myself have already discovered the first treasure." He took it very well. "Too bad, too bad. Posts from here must be odd. Barford and I started at once." We did not dare to confess the perfidy of Uncle Miles. "Anyway, we shall all start fair for the second round," said Fenella. "Splendid. What about getting down to the clues right away? Your excellent Mrs. Skillicorn holds them, I believe." "That wouldn't be fair to Mr. Corjeg," said Fenella quickly. "We must wait for him." True, I had forgotten. We must get in touch with him as quickly as possible. I will see to that. You two must be tired out and want to rest." Thereupon he took his departure. You and Corjeg must have been unexpectedly difficult to find, for it was not till nearly 11 o'clock that night that Dr. Fayle rang up. He suggested that he and Ewan should come over to Moorhold House at 10 o'clock the following morning, when Mrs. Skillicorn could hand us out the clues. "That will do splendidly," said Fenella. 10 o'clock tomorrow." We retired to bed tired, but happy. The following morning we were aroused by Mrs. Skillicorn, completely shaken out of her usual pessimistic calm. "Whatever did you think?" she panted. "The house has been broken into." "Burglars?" I exclaimed incredulously. "Has anything been taken?" "Not a thing, and that's the odd part of it. No doubt they were after the silver, but the door being locked on the outside they couldn't get any further." Fenella and I accompanied her to the scene of the outrage, which happened to be in her own sitting-room. The window there had undeniably been forced, yet nothing seemed to have been taken. It was all rather curious. "I don't see what they can have been looking for," said Fenella. "It's not as though there were a treasure chest hidden in the house," I agreed facetiously.
Suddenly an idea flashed into my mind. I turned to Mrs. Skillicorn. "The clues. The clues you were to give us this morning?"
"Why, to be sure. They're in that top drawer."
She went across to it.
"Why, I do declare, there's nothing here. They're gone."
"Not burglars," I said. "Our esteemed relations." And I remember Uncle Miles's warning on the subject of unscrupulous dealing. Clearly he had known what he was talking about. A dirty trick.
"Hush,"
said Fenella, suddenly holding up a finger.
"What was that?"
The sound she had caught came plainly to our ears. It was a groan, and it came from outside. We went to the window and leaned out. There was a shrubbery growing against this side of the house, and we could see nothing, but the groan came again, and we could see that the bushes seemed to have been disturbed and trampled. We hurried down and out round the house. The first thing we found was a fallen ladder, showing how the thieves had reached the window. A few steps further brought us to where a man was lying. He was a youngish man, dark, and he was evidently badly injured, for his head was lying in a pool of blood. I knelt down beside him. "We must get a doctor at once. I'm afraid he's dying." The gardener was sent off hurriedly. I slipped my hand into his breast pocket and brought out a pocket-book. On it were the initials E.C.
"Ewan Corjeg,"
said Fenella. The man's eyes opened. He said faintly,
"Fell from ladder,"
then lost consciousness again. Close by his head was a large jagged stone stained with blood. "It's clear enough," I said. "The ladder slipped and he fell, striking his head on this stone. I'm afraid it's done for him, poor fellow." "So you think that was it?" said Fenella, in an odd tone of voice. But at that moment the doctor arrived. He held out little hope of recovery. Ewan Corjeg was moved into the house, and a nurse was sent for to take charge of him. Nothing could be done, and he would die a couple of hours later. We had been sent for and were standing by his bed. His eyes opened and flickered. "We are your cousins, Juan and Fenella," I said. "Is there anything we can do?" He made a faint negative motion of the head. A whisper came from his lips. I bent to catch it.
"Do you want the clue? I'm done. Don't let fail do you down."
"Yes," said Fenella. "Tell me." Something like a grin came over his face.
"D'ye ken—"
he began. Then suddenly his head fell over sideways, and he died. "I don't like it," said Fenella suddenly. "What don't you like?"
"Listen, Juan, Ewan stole those clues. He admits falling from the ladder."
"Then where are they? We've seen all the contents of his pockets. There were 3 sealed envelopes, so Mrs. Skillicorn says. Those sealed envelopes aren't there." "What do you think, then?"
"I think there was someone else there. Someone who jerked away the ladder so that he fell. And that stone, he never fell on it. It was brought from some distance away. I found the mark. He was deliberately bashed on the head with it."
"But, Fenella, that's murder."
"Yes,"
said Fenella, very white.
"It's murder. Remember, Dr. Fayle never turned up at 10 o'clock this morning. Where is he?"
"You think he's the murderer?"
"Yes. You know, this treasure, it's a lot of money, Juan."
"And we've no idea where to look for him," I said. "A pity Corjeg couldn't have finished what he was going to say."
"There's one thing might help. This was in his hand."
She handed me a torn snapshot.
"Suppose it's a clue. The murderer snatched it away and never noticed he'd left a corner of it behind. If we were to find the other half—"
"To do that," I said, "we must find the second treasure. Let's look at this thing." I said. "There's nothing much to go by. That seems a kind of tower in the middle of the circle, but it would be very hard to identify." Fenella nodded.
"Dr. Fayle has the important half. He knows where to look. We've got to find that man, Juan, and watch him. Of course, we won't let him see we suspect."
"I wonder whereabouts in the island he is this minute. If we only knew." My mind went back to the dying man. Suddenly I sat up excitedly. "Fenella," I said, "Corjeg wasn't Scotch."
"No, of course not."
"Well then, don't you see? What he meant, I mean?"
"No?"
I scribbled something on a piece of paper and tossed it to her.
"What's this?"
"The name of a firm that might help us."
"Bellman and True? Who are they, lawyers?"
"No, they're more in our line.
private detectives. And I proceeded to explain. "Doctor failed to see you," said Mrs. Skillicorn. We looked at each other. 24 hours had elapsed. We had returned from our quest, successful for the second time. Not wishing to draw attention to ourselves, we had journeyed in the snaffle, a shadow-bang. "I wonder if he knows we saw him in the distance," murmured Fenella. "It's extraordinary. If it hadn't been for the hint that photograph gave us—" "Hush, and do be careful, Juan. He must be simply furious at our having outwitted him in spite of everything." No trace of it appeared in the doctor's manner, however. He entered the room his urbane and charming self, and I felt my faith in Fenella's theory dwindling. "What a shocking tragedy," he said. "Poor Kojeg. I suppose he was, well, trying to steal a march on us. Retribution was swift. Well, we scarcely knew him, poor fellow. You must have wondered why I didn't turn up this morning as arranged. I got a fake message, Kojeg's doing, I suppose. It sent me off on a wild goose chase right across the island. And now you two have romped home again. How do you do it?" There was a note of really eager inquiry in his voice which did not escape me. "Cousin Ewan was fortunately able to speak just before he died," said Fenella. I was watching the man, and I could swear I saw alarm leap into his eyes at her words. Eh? What's that?" he said. "He was just able to give us a clue as to the whereabouts of the treasure," explained Fenella. "Oh, I see. I've been clean out of things, though, curiously enough, I myself was in that part of the island. You may have seen me strolling around." "We were so busy," said Fenella apologetically. Of course. You must have run across the thing more or less by accident. Lucky young people, aren't you? Well, what's the next programme? Will Mrs. Skillicorn oblige us with the new clues?" But it seemed that this third set of clues had been deposited with the lawyers, and we all three repaired to the lawyer's office, where the sealed envelopes were handed over to us. The contents were simple: a map with a certain area marked off on it, and a paper of directions attached. "In 85 this place made history. 10 paces from the landmark to the east, then an equal 10 paces north. Stand there, looking east. 2 trees are in the line of vision. One of them was sacred in this island. Draw a circle 5 feet from the Spanish chestnut, and with head bent walk round. Look well. You'll find." "Looks as though we were going to tread on each other's toes a bit today," commented the doctor. True to my policy of apparent friendliness, I offered him a lift in our car, which he accepted. We had lunch at Port Erin and then started on our search. I had debated in my own mind the reason of my uncle's depositing this particular set of clues with his lawyer. Had he foreseen the possibility of a theft? And had he determined that not more than one set of clues should fall into the thief's possession? The treasure hunt this afternoon was not without its humour. The area of search was limited, and we were continually in sight of each other. We eyed each other suspiciously, each trying to determine whether the other was farther on or had had a brainwave. "This is all part of Uncle Miles's plan," said Fenella. "He wanted us to watch each other and go through all the agonies of thinking the other person was getting there." "Come," I said, "let's get down to it scientifically. We've got one definite clue to start on. In 85 this place made history. Look up the reference books we've got with us and see if we can't hunt that down. Once we get that—" "He's looking in that hedge," interrupted Fenella. "Oh, I can't bear it. If he's got it—" "Attend to me," I said firmly. "There's really only one way to go about it, the proper way. There are so few trees on the island that it would be much simpler just to look for a chestnut tree," said Fenella. I pass over the next hour. We grew hot and despondent, and all the time we were tortured with fear that fail might be succeeding whilst we failed. "I remember once reading in a detective story," I said, "how a fellow stuck a paper of writing in a bath of acid, and all sorts of other words came out." "Do you think— But we haven't got a bath of acid." "I don't think Uncle Miles could expect expert chemical knowledge, but there's common or garden heat." We slipped round the corner of a hedge, and in a minute or two I had kindled a few twigs. I held the paper as close to the blaze as I dared.
almost at once I was rewarded by seeing characters begin to appear at the foot of the sheet. There were just 2 words. "Hercule Station," read out Fenella. Just at that moment, Fale came round the corner. Whether he had heard or not, we had no means of judging. He showed nothing. "But Juan," said Fenella when he moved away, "there isn't a Hercule Station." She held out the map as she spoke. "No," I said, examining it. "But look here." And with a pencil I drew a line on it. "Of course. And somewhere on that line—" "Exactly. But I wish we knew the exact spot." It was then that my second brainwave came to me. "We do!" I cried, and seizing the pencil again I said, "Look!" Fenella uttered a cry. "How idiotic!" she cried. "And how marvellous! What a sell! Really, Uncle Miles was a most ingenious old gentleman." The time had come for the last clue. This, the lawyer had informed us, was not in his keeping. It was to be posted to us on receipt of a postcard sent by him. He would impart no further information. Nothing arrived, however, on the morning it should have done, and Fenella and I went through agonies believing that Fale had managed somehow to intercept our letter. The next day, however, our fears were calmed and the mystery explained when we received the following illiterate scrawl. "Dear Sir or Madam, excuse delay, but I've been all 6s and 7s, but I do now as Mr. Mulcrane asked me to, and send you the piece of writing what has been in my family many long years, though what he wanted it for I do not know. Thanking you I am, Mary Carush." "Postmark, Bride," I remarked. "Now for the piece of writing handed down in my family. Upon a rock a sign you'll see. Oh, tell me what the point of that may be. Well, firstly, A. Nearby you'll find, quite suddenly, the light you seek. Then B. A house, a cottage with a thatch and wall, a meandering lane nearby. That's all." "It's very unfair to begin with a rock," said Fenella. "There are rocks everywhere. How can you tell which one has the sign on it?" "If we could settle on the district," I said, "it ought to be fairly easy to find the rock. It must have a mark on it, pointing in a certain direction, and in that direction there will be something hidden which will throw light on the finding of the treasure." "I think you're right," said Fenella. "That's A. The new clue will give us a hint where B, the cottage, is to be found. The treasure itself is hidden down a lane outside the cottage, but clearly we've got to find A first." Owing to the difficulty of the initial step, Uncle Miles's last problem proved a real teaser. To Fenella falls the distinction of unravelling it, and even then she did not accomplish it for nearly a week. Now and then we had come across Fale in our search of rocky districts, but the area was a wide one. When we finally made our discovery it was late in the evening. Too late, I said, to start off to the place indicated. Fenella disagreed. "Supposing Fale finds it too," she said, "and we wait till tomorrow and he starts off tonight. How we should kick ourselves!" Suddenly, a marvellous idea occurred to me. "Fenella," I said, "do you still believe that Fale murdered you and Corjeg?" "I do." "Then I think that now we've got our chance to bring the crime home to him." "That man makes me shiver. He's bad all through. Tell me." "Advertise the fact that we've found A, then start off. 10 to 1 he'll follow us. It's a lonely place, just what would suit his book. He'll come out in the open if we pretend to find the treasure." "And then?" "And then," I said, "he'll have a little surprise." It was close on midnight. We had left the car some distance away and were creeping along by the side of the wall. Fenella had a powerful flashlight which she was using. I myself carried a revolver. I was taking no chances. Suddenly, with a low cry, Fenella stopped. "Look, Juan," she cried. "We've got it, at last!" For a moment I was off my guard. Led by instinct, I whirled round, but too late. Fale stood 6 paces away, and his revolver covered us both. "Good evening," he said. "This trick is mine. You'll hand over that treasure, if you please." "Would you like me also to hand over something else?" I asked. "Half a snapshot torn from a dying man's hand? You have the other half, I think." His hand wavered. "What are you talking about?" he growled. "The truth's known," I said. "You and Corjeg were there together. You pulled away the ladder and crashed his head with that stone.
The police are cleverer than you imagine, Dr. Fail. They know, do they? Then, by heaven, I'll swing for 3 murders instead of 1. Drop, Fenella! I screamed, and at the same minute his revolver barked loudly. We had both dropped in the heather, and before he could fire again, uniformed men sprang out from behind the wall where they had been hiding. A moment later, Fail had been handcuffed and led away. I caught Fenella in my arms. "I knew I was right," she said tremulously. "Darling," I cried, "it was too risky. He might have shot you." "But he didn't," said Fenella. "And we know where the treasure is." "Do we?" "I do. See?" She scribbled a word. "We look for it tomorrow. There can't be many hiding places there, I should say." It was just noon when— "Eureka!" said Fenella softly. "The 4th snuff-box. We've got them all. Uncle Miles would be pleased. And now—" "Now," I said, "we can be married and live together happily ever afterwards." "We'll live in the Isle of Man," said Fenella. "On Manx gold," I said, and laughed aloud for sheer happiness.
Within a Wall. It was Mrs. Lempriere who discovered the existence of Jane Howarth. It would be, of course. Somebody once said that Mrs. Lempriere was easily the most hated woman in London, but that, I think, is an exaggeration. She has certainly a knack of tumbling on the one thing you wish to keep quiet about, and she does it with real genius. It is always an accident. In this case, we'd been having tea in Alan Everard's studio. He gave these teas occasionally, and used to stand about in corners wearing very old clothes, rattling the coppers in his trouser pocket, and looking profoundly miserable. I do not suppose anyone will dispute Everard's claim to genius at this date. His 2 most famous pictures, Colour and The Connoisseur, which belong to his earlier period, before he became a fashionable portrait painter, were purchased by the nation last year, and for once the choice went unchallenged. But at the date of which I speak, Everard was only beginning to come into his own, and we were free to consider that we had discovered him. It was his wife who organised these parties. Everard's attitude to her was a peculiar one. That he adored her was evident, and only to be expected. Adoration was Isabel's due, but he seemed always to feel himself slightly in her debt. He assented to anything she wished, not so much through tenderness as through an unalterable conviction that she had a right to her own way. I suppose that was natural enough, too, when one comes to think of it. For Isabel Loring had been really very celebrated. When she came out, she had been the debutante of the season. She had everything, except money. Beauty, position, breeding, brains. Nobody expected her to marry for love. She wasn't that kind of girl. In her 2nd season, she had 3 strings to her bow: the heir to a dukedom, a rising politician, and a South African millionaire. And then, to everyone's surprise, she married Alan Everard, a struggling young painter whom no one had ever heard of. It is a tribute to her personality, I think, that everyone went on calling her Isabel Loring. No one ever alluded to her as Isabel Everard. It would be, "I saw Isabel Loring this morning. Yes, with her husband, young Everard, the painter fellow." People said Isabel had done for herself. It would, I think, have done for most men to be known as Isabel Loring's husband. But Everard was different. Isabel's talent for success hadn't failed her after all. Alan Everard painted colour. I suppose everyone knows the picture. A stretch of road with a trench dug in it. The turned earth, reddish in colour, a shining length of brown glazed drainpipe, and the huge navvy resting for a minute on his spade. A Herculean figure in stained corduroys with a scarlet neckerchief. His eyes look out at you from the canvas, without intelligence, without hope, but with a dumb, unconscious pleading, the eyes of a magnificent brute beast. It is a flaming thing, a symphony of orange and red. A lot has been written about its symbolism, about what it is meant to express. But Alan Everard himself says he didn't mean it to express anything. He was, he said, nauseated by having to look at a lot of pictures of Venetian sunsets, and a sudden longing for a riot of purely English colour assailed him. After that, Everard gave the world that epic painting of a public house, Romance. The black street with rain falling, the half-open door, the lights and shining glasses, the little foxy-faced man passing through the doorway, small, mean, insignificant, with lips parted and eyes eager, passing in to forget. On the strength of these two pictures, Everard was acclaimed as a painter of working men. He had his niche, but he refused to stay in it. His third and most brilliant work, a full-length portrait of Sir Rufus Hirschman. The famous scientist is painted against a background of retorts and crucibles and laboratory shelves. The whole has what may be called a cubist effect, but the lines of perspective run strangely. And now he had completed his fourth work, a portrait of his wife. We had been invited to see and criticise. Everard himself scowled and looked out of the window. Isabel Loring moved amongst the guests, talking technique with unerring accuracy. We made comments. We had to. We praised the painting of the pink satin. The treatment of that, we said, was really marvellous. Nobody had painted satin in quite that way before. Mrs. Lempriere, who is one of the most intelligent art critics I know, took me aside almost at once. "Georgie," she said, "what has he done to himself? The thing's dead. It's smooth, it's damnable." "Portrait of a lady in pink satin?" "Exactly. And yet the technique's perfect. And the care. There's enough work there for 16 pictures. "Too much work?" I suggested. Perhaps that's it. If there was ever anything there, he's killed it. An extremely beautiful woman in a pink satin dress. Why not a coloured photograph?" "Why not?" I agreed. "Do you suppose he knows?" "Of course he knows," said Mrs. Lempriere scornfully. "Don't you see? The man's on the edge. It comes, I dare say, of mixing up sentiment and business. He's put his whole soul into painting Isabel because she's Isabel. And in sparing her, he's lost her. He's been too kind. You've got to destroy the flesh before you can get the soul sometimes." I nodded reflectively. Sir Rufus Hirschman had not been flattered physically, but Everard had succeeded in putting on the canvas a personality that was unforgettable. "And Isabel's got such a very forceful personality," continued Mrs. Lempriere. "Perhaps Everard can't paint women," I said. Perhaps not," said Mrs. Lempriere thoughtfully. "Yes, that may be the explanation." And it was then, with her usual genius for accuracy, that she pulled out a canvas that was leaning with its face to the wall. There were about 8 of them stacked carelessly. It was pure chance that Mrs. Lempriere selected the one she did, but as I said before, these things happen with Mrs. Lempriere. "Ah," said Mrs. Lempriere, as she turned it to the light. It was unfinished, a mere rough sketch. The woman, or girl, she was not, I thought, more than 25 or 6, was leaning forward, her chin on her hand. 2 things struck me at once: the extraordinary vitality of the picture and the amazing cruelty of it. Everard had painted with a vindictive brush. The attitude, even, was a cruel one. It had brought out every awkwardness, every sharp angle, every crudity. It was a study in brown. Brown dress, brown background, brown eyes, wistful, eager eyes. Eagerness was, indeed, the prevailing note of it. Mrs. Lempriere looked at it for some minutes in silence. Then she called to Everard. "Alain," she said, "come here. Who's this?" Everard came over obediently. I saw the sudden flash of annoyance that he could not quite hide. "Oh, that's only a daub," he said. "I don't suppose I shall ever finish it." "Who is she?" said Mrs. Lempriere. Everard was clearly unwilling to answer.